Hello. Good afternoon from the UK and good morning from the US as we start yet another exciting episode of Lorebeards. But before we go, could we please have some confirmation that the sound is coming through and we don't sound like digital robots or just sound like nothing? That would be absolutely marvelous if you are out there in the chat right now and it's working well.
Yep, we sound good. We're good.
Excellent. Good to hear it. I'm really looking forward to today's episode because it's about a character that I initially really disliked. And when I say disliked, oh yeah, I really disliked it. And I disliked it for just one reason, because I'm a little bit petty sometimes. And what I disliked it for was the miniature. The original Durthu miniature, yeah. I must have painted it like about 10 times. And it's easy to paint, dry brush, done, yeah! Super easy, but it was about... It was about as characterful as a bunch of badly posed twigs can be. It just didn't look that great. And as the great character that it was, Durthu, this ancient Treeman, it just didn't look cool. However, they obviously completely changed that later when we moved into the 8th edition and we got an absolutely spiffy set of Wood Elf miniatures. The replacements for them, in fact, my eldest daughter, who's over there, she got them, because she had a Wood Elf army back then, and I was super jealous because they were so freaking gorgeous. When you saw Durthu sitting beside all of the various dryads, you were like, yeah, now this kicks ass. This proper kicks ass. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I think Games Workshop was keenly aware that they had hit on a winning design, seeing as then when they went into Age of Sigmar, they immediately were like, all right, dump the elves, just trees. We know how to make trees now. Let's just do that.
And they're just lovely. I mean, they're
beautiful sculpts.
Yeah, super, super lovely. So as always, today we will be diving into the lore concerning one of the Warhammer characters in this case, Durthu, the most ancient of ancients, that truly elder spirit of Athel Loren. And we're going to be doing this in, let's say, steps where we discuss it a bit. And then we dive into any super chats that might have come through, and then we discuss it a bit more, and then maybe I whinge about the old miniature again, and then we discuss it a little bit more again.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it. Before we get going, are there any kind of big things that need to be discussed real quick as far as things coming up in the immediate future that come to your mind?
Well, I've got a stream coming up for Inside the Rookery, but it's for their patrons. But I'll bring it up because it's quite a fun one where we're going to be discussing how to develop. In fact, we're going to be discussing the whole process of writing adventures for role-playing games, because I used to commission them back when I was the good old producer for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and in previous jobs as well. And I have written so many of them too. And there's an actual process that many people aren't aware of. And we've already written an adventure as part of a previous masterclass. So we're going to be showing the process of developing that into a finished project. So that's going to be, I think, super fun. That's going to be a week Monday. So not this Monday, the Monday afterwards. It's going to be the masterclass that we run over on Inside the Rookery. But beyond that, as always, as I say, pretty much every week, and will continue to do until the bloody game's released, go and check out Dark Deeds, because it's a truly awesome game, which I think everybody who enjoys beer and pretzel board games will really get a kick out of, because you get this backstab your mates and in the service of a mysterious patron in a fantasy city. Who doesn't like the sound of that?
I am super excited for that game.
Go grab the link for that. Yeah, it's super fun. I'll go grab the link for that. It was designed by Andy Chambers, who you may know as the Skaven King from back in the older versions of Warhammer, because he was attached to almost everything Skaven. But he wrote tons of stuff for Warhammer that we now just know and love as the core material. And it has been illustrated by Andy Chambers. Not Andy Chambers, I just said Andy Chambers, by Mark Gibbons. Mark Gibbons, who you may know for pretty much all the art throughout the course of the 4th and the 5th edition of the game. Every single iconic piece of art that you're aware of, Mark did. So those two were squirrely away in that. And then I came in for this most recent edition and did a complete rejig of the rules. And it's just really good. It's just super fun. It's fast, it's fun, and hilarious. I constantly find myself laughing about it while we play.
All right. And then to get caught up on the starting super chats, and then we will hop into it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely perfect thing. There's the link for anybody out there who wants it. Just dropped it into the chat. Please do pop over there and do sign up and subscribe. All you'll get from that is the eventual release date whenever they get there. There is obviously problems over in the Red Sea just now, meaning that game deliveries come whenever they come.
It'll get here when it gets here.
Who knows when it's eventually going to arrive, but it is definitely over with the factory getting done.
So, Durthu's manservant, thank you for the Durthu chant. Yep. I'm glad his manservant has arrived to make sure we do our job correctly. Also, I do want to say the vote for this week was super interesting. Y'all had a really hard time narrowing down. Vampires only lost by 1%.
It was super close.
Out of like 10,000 votes. So that was really narrow. And the Inevitable City actually did really well too. Like it was in like the upper 20%. So like there was less than a 10% difference between it and the other two. So we did a good job picking the subjects this week. That's what that means.
We certainly did. And I'd just like to say super thanks to everybody that did vote. It makes an enormous difference because we get an idea not just of which one you want to see next, but also which ones we might want to add on to later ones. So, and this one was super close. You'll probably find some of these topics popping up again.
Yep. Biofoot, rejoice! Andy has returned from the mines early. You been in the mines, Andy?
Always. Sitting down in my word mines, most commonly tapping away.
Payment to my Warhammer lore dealers on Shady Sunday. Nice. Yep.
I salute thee, Ray's Shaman, for your I'm peddling you now, your Warhammer goodies. There you go. I am the dealer.
Hey kid, you want some Warhammer lore? Durthu, one of my favorite characters in Warhammer Fantasy and the centerpiece of my Azrai Warhost, glorious and tragic, not Treebeard.
Yeah. I mean, not unfair, and glorious is spot on and also tragic. As we make our way through this particular set of lore, it's going to be a little bit hard for me not to just go, poor Durthu.
Yeah, that is probably going to be the pull through theme.
Yeah, absolutely.
The undead thought they could beat Durthu, but once again, he kicked their shit in. That's true.
Yeah,
he does have a good win record there. Jonathan Scott, what did Durthu say to Drycha? Hey, baby, I hope you like tending to the forest because I've got plenty of wood for you. I'll see myself out. Yes, thank you. Please leave.
I mean, we appreciate the chat, Jonathan, but the comment, seriously.
How does Orion get his food? Thriving. Derive through. Sorry. Derive through. It's actually better than what I said. Derive through. Is this a tree stream or an acorny one? Ha ha ha. Okay, y'all.
Sean.
All right, get them all out now. Get them all out now.
Yeah, get them out now.
Durthu's favorite beer, root beer. Okay. All right, enough of that. So, Dr. Bowler, thank you for the sub, by the way. All right, so
super appreciated.
Get into it. So, Durthu is a super interesting character. One of the things that's really interesting to start with, right at the start. Okay, hold on. I'm going to get this out of the way because I want to get them all out of the way now. What did Durthu do when the Altdorf Bank turned him away? He opened his own branch.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, Hammond, have you actually just logged a bunch of these in a spreadsheet? You can just go, like a copy C, copy V. Oh, yes, here comes another Woody joke.
He's been writing in a journal all week. Durthu is a super interesting character to look at initially from like a outside universe perspective. So from a development perspective, because he is one of the most extreme examples of a character who got development in a much older edition and then suddenly leaped forward, but did not go. He went through changes, but not as dramatic as you might expect. The last time Durthu was really written on before the end of Warhammer was actually 5th edition. Yeah. Because he wasn't playable and barely gets mentioned at all in 6th edition. Like Coadil gets more lore than Durthu does. And then in 8th edition, he jumps to being one of the most important characters in the Wood Elf book. So he gets like a ton of new lore.
Yeah.
And becomes a significantly more important character, which makes sense because they gave him a brand shining new mini and all that other stuff. So, you know, it's always good to do that. But I really like what they did with him. Which is what we're going to be mostly focusing on. I don't think there's a ton to really talk about as far as his like original version goes.
No, I think I'm quite happy to skip over that and just go into who he is now, because the original version has been largely either rewritten or alternatively just expanded upon. So I think starting off at the 8th edition of the game and looking at exactly where Durthu has his roots, so to speak, and then take those through to the modern version of him and the let's say comparison between the character that he began as and the character that he will eventually become.
All right. So, with no further ado,
no, I'm going to bring it up just so we've got it out of the
way. These puns are unbearable, and I'm about to leave, but I'm having a whale of a time. Only one of those is on topic. Careful,
this is going to be
bite is as bad as their bark. Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
yeah.
Sorry, I missed that one.
Yeah. Yes, it is. All right. Anyway, get up. Just thank you for the support, I guess.
You guys rock. You keep us sane.
One of the things that 8th edition does that was really, really different from all the editions before that I like a lot is that 8th edition pulls back the curtain a bit as far as like the creation of Athel Loren. It doesn't explicitly spell out everything that happens. Like it leaves a lot of the mystery. But what one of the big, I don't know if I call it a retcon because it's technically filling in something that wasn't really talked about beforehand.
Yep.
But one of the things they talk about is that Athel Loren in 8th edition is revealed to be part of the whole Old One shenanigans.
Yeah.
Where they where it says that so after the creation of the lizardmen, but before the creation of the elves, so predating the elves as a species, the Old Ones planted what will become Athel Loren. So they did something to a bunch of seeds and presumably planted the Oak of Ages.
Yeah, there's a lovely few lines concerning this. Basically, what we get is confirmation that Athel Loren is not just something special by mistake or because the Warhammer world is the way the Warhammer world is. It's very much a creation of the Old Ones, but they do, however, muddy it up just a little bit by saying what it then develops into as the spirits come alive and the first great Treeman spirits, for example, come to consciousness rather than just simply being trees. They leave a certain amount of ambiguity where they say, was this the influence of, for example, the elven gods, or was this the Old Ones? And they don't say it was one or the other. And it's those lines and lines like these that later writers like myself picked up, or indeed I actually wrote this back in 7th edition, so perhaps it was bridged into here and then I picked it up before. Whatever, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, good guy, Andy. I'm just gonna
damn it. As it turns out that I wrote before this one, but it doesn't really matter. I also wrote after it. That they pick them up and you can begin to get the greater depth of lore that circulates around both the elven gods and the Old Ones and exactly what they are and are not. But what we can say for pretty much certain, without any fear of great contradiction beyond Games Workshop rewriting it again, is that Athel Loren is 100% a creation of the Old Ones. And as we know, they have a great plan, meaning that Athel Loren and everything that comes from it is a part of their great plan. And particularly as the great world roots spread out from the great oak that sat in the middle of that magical wood, you can clearly see the bridges that lie between what becomes basically the elven world teleportation device that they can use to put elves anywhere in the world, which is a really handy thing for the battle game. Trust me. What do we do with our xenophobic wood elves that never, ever, ever leave their forest? I know. We'll give them a teleportation device that allows them to go to any forest in the world ever. Problem fixed. Yeah. So all of that is set up here, and it makes sense as well when you look at it in terms of what the Old Ones were capable of with their tech. But remember that a lot of their tech is not simply technology as we understand it. Much of it is, of course, but some of it is also, let's say, sorcery technology, a sorcery science, so to speak. And the world roots very much reflect the great gates that they've got spanning across the world already. And indeed, you can easily see how the world roots are a reflection of, well, we can clearly see that it's a reflection of the geomantic web and how that's also all connected with its great ley lines. It's all part of the same pattern. It's all part of the same basic job, but you can see that they're all working in slightly different ways. But we are talking here like 10, 15, 10,000 years ago at least.
Oh yeah,
When
probably
this is,
at least
when this
10.
happened, at least, yeah.
One of the things that is one of the things that's really interesting to consider about Athel Loren being created with the old ones in this case is trying to, that is worth leading into Durthu, is kind of considering, like Andy said, what exactly the old ones may have been trying to accomplish. Because, like Andy said, the book does I love that it does a good job of saying that the actual spirits, like the forest gaining consciousness and coming alive and the tree starting to move, very well may not have been intended. It may have been more of a consequence. And like Andy said, it's like, oh, was it the elves? Was it the old ones? Or it could have just been, it's just a consequence of what they did. Where maybe no one meddled with it necessarily, or there was even a different outside influence. But one of the things that's really interesting to think about, in my opinion, is considering that this is pre-elves, you almost see what the old ones are doing of trying to create something organic that can contain magic. Which, if you think about what the elves are, being a species that is very, very magically saturated, you can almost kind of see an interesting evolution between the old ones experimenting with creating plant life that's designed to absorb and manipulate magic, but it didn't have the necessary it didn't result in what they ultimately wanted, or perhaps it performed its role, but they wanted something grander, and then they moved on to creating blooded life with the elves, which came with its own unintended consequences.
So I think that it's worth definitely examining this just a little bit, because we have got ourselves different versions for what the great plan may be. That the most recent version of the game, the old world, has sort of repositioned slightly, in that where they left it relatively ambiguous through the pretty much all previous editions of Warhammer, they pretty much stated a couple of things in the old world, and go check our streams about how old world lore changed the Warhammer world. They pretty much confirmed that the great plan was for the end of the world, that the great plan was for the Age of Sigmar and what came afterwards. That being the case, then Athel Loren and everything that it represents and moves on to become later is clearly part of the great plan. And much of the ambiguity that is added in this book can be sort of dusted away with a quick, yeah, that's what the old ones intended. It doesn't actually matter who did it. Doesn't matter if it was the elven gods that put this in place, whether it was the old ones that put it in place, whether it was some early species that was spun up by the old ones that dicked around planting trees. It doesn't really matter. What actually does, I think, matter is that this is very much old one plan. Now, what that means, nobody really knows. It's still just as ambiguous as it always was. But what we can say in a way that we couldn't say if we were just looking at 8th edition books is that the old ones not only had a plan, that the complete collapse of the world was that plan. Now, was it the only plan? That can be still debated, because there's still a lot of ambiguity around there. But it is certainly clear that they came to the Warhammer world, that they very much ensured that the winds of magic were the way they were. They built the world the way it was with the intent of it all going boom, so that the Age of Sigmar, let's say, outcome was very much part of what they wanted. And that in and of itself is super fascinating. But the only other thing I'll say about the planting of Athel Loren and what will become the first awakening of the wood with good old Durthu is that it definitely comes post the old ones. And this is worth saying, because I've seen in a couple of discussions over the years that possibly Durthu is a far more ancient creature that is perhaps already suggested. He's already super ancient. And that possibly the great Athel Loren forest was something that the old ones came to and adapted. This almost certainly isn't the case, because the world was too cold. Yeah. This is not the sort of place where you'd be getting giant forests at approximately this part of the world. The band of, let's say, life that would have existed when the Warhammer world was far further away from the sun. It was an equatorial band, and Athel Loren is quite high up. That being the case, the chances that Athel Loren existed before the old ones is pretty much nil. So if you're of that opinion, I would gently suggest that your opinion should be kind of readdressed, because it's pretty clear that the Athel forest was created by the old ones, and what it becomes was almost certainly a plan, if not necessarily the plan.
Yeah. So from here, we get the quote unquote birth of Durthu. We don't know exactly what leads into the creation of a forest spirit. They seem to kind of just, whether, because for those unaware, treemen and dryads and stuff, when you see like the actual forest, like the thing that represents the many, that's not what they really are. It is an aspect of what they are. It is often referred to as their war aspect. So it's them in their most dangerous form. But especially back in the older days, they were spirits in the truest sense, where they may not even have had physical forms, or if they did, they were very, very, very different looking. We wouldn't see the development of what we understand to be treemen and dryads until later, when they start binding themselves into physical forms so that they can more acutely interact with the physical world, is probably a safe way to put it. But so Durthu appears, and he is what's known as an elder. And the elders of Athel, you can kind of think of them as like the Slann of Athel.
Yeah,
where
exactly
they are,
what I was going to say.
Yeah, they're extremely powerful, super freaking old spirits.
Yeah, and there's not just one or two of these. There are hundreds of them back
Yeah, a whole
then.
bunch.
There is a lot of them. And these are, much like the old Slann, exceedingly powerful entities. When it eventually turns to the war against chaos, it's fair to say, to reinforce what Sotek just said there, that the demons that were flooding across the world did not see the great spirits of Athel as all that much different from them, because they are etheric entities. They are spirits. They are not material by their natural origins. However, having said that, though, the great magical forest that is Athel, and as we'll probably discuss other places later, is so saturated with magic that they can manifest in the material plane. And indeed, they don't just manifest there, they live there. It's almost like the trees themselves gain sentience, and that sentience was the great spirits that lay beyond, and then they came back to the material world where they had come from. The magic, perhaps, that had seeped its way through those forests had effectively created the equivalent of tiny gods over on the other side, which then came back. And you'll find that this is a common theme throughout Warhammer in all of its various stories across the world, where there are local things, whether it is mountains, rivers, or whatever, that have spirits. And they manifest very differently in different parts of the Warhammer world. But Athel in particular, because it was so steeped with magic, because of whatever it was that the old ones did, whatever was sitting at the heart with that great oak that lay there, allowed what was birthed here to not just be different, but also extraordinarily powerful.
Yeah, and this leads into, of course, talking about the world roots very quickly, because they're going to play a super important part about what's to happen. So the world roots, for those of you who play Total War, you're probably vaguely familiar with the concept. And like Andy said earlier, they're kind of like a geomantic web that is centralized from the Oak of Ages itself, where one of the things the Oak of Ages does, which I think is super fascinating to think about what it was designed to do by the old ones, because they almost assuredly planted it as kind of the main focal point of Athel, is that the world roots attach the Oak of Ages to pretty much every forest in the world and seem to draw magic from those places into Athel. So, like, instead of the roots seeking out water or nutrients, they seem to seek out forests that have any kind of magical presence, which connects it all over the place. Now, what's implied but not stated is that many of the world roots are not physical. Because, for instance, Avalorn in Ulthuan has a world root connected to it, despite the fact that Ulthuan is a floating island in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't connect to the seafloor. There's nothing for the root to burrow through unless it like just traveled all the way across the ocean, which it almost assuredly didn't. Instead, these are etheric pathways, which means they can go everywhere without limitation. And it also is what allows for transference among them to be potentially like instant, which it is in most cases.
And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important that we recognize that this isn't the only example of this. We have the paths of the old ones, for want of a better description, which are the routes through the world that the old ones used to use. The basically tiny gates, much like the collapsed gates at the two north and south poles. These tiny gates allowed instantaneous travel. And come the modern Warhammer in 8th edition, many of these old routes still exist, but they are very different. Thousands of years have passed, and many of them now look like old corridors or weird, let's say, passages. And they manifest in lots of different ways according to the individuals that pass through them. And the world routes are not so different. Equally, when we discussed the Maw and the Galleon's graveyard in one of our previous streams, go take a check in that. We also discussed how the Maw connecting through to the Galleon's graveyard almost certainly wasn't a physical connection. It was an etheric one. But that doesn't mean that if you were a mortal soul passing through it, you wouldn't see it as a material, let's say, pathway that you then make your way through.
As your brain's trying to comprehend it.
Yeah, exactly. And further to this, we also have other examples of world route-like passageways that pass through the Warhammer world. The Jade College, for example, is known for having, let's say, world routes, for want of a better description, that allows them to, say, move from the Jade College directly through into the deep parts of the Great Forest. And they, in turn, are connected through to ancient druidic practices. And they almost certainly also had their own ways of passing through the Great Forest paths. And some of these still exist up in the Lorelorn forest, and they popped up in various books, in various novels, and often protected by pretty nasty spirits, dryad alike type spirits, or naiads, or something similar. And they often demand blood or some other horrendous sacrifice just to use them. So don't think of the world routes as anything particularly unique, but do think of them as something particularly extensive and far more, I would argue, controlled than many of the other ones, most of which have collapsed, have fallen in, or are just really bloody dangerous, where the world routes are dangerous for a completely different reason, and that's because they are controlled, as we'll find later, by elves that are using it, obviously, but by the great spirits that inhabit them. It's not the sort of place you want to go if you are, for example, a beastman. And as we'll get onto, these world routes also contain more than just handy little pathways. There's entire worlds down there.
Yeah. So the spirits of Athel as the forest is just naturally expanding, which Athel before the Cataclysm gets big. Like, it stretches way beyond its modern borders.
Yeah.
It probably went all the way to the ocean, taking over most of the coast of Bretonnia. But it was a very large expanse because there was nothing really to threaten it back in those times. And the old ones were likely okay with it doing that. But what we see is that the forest spirits begin to travel through the world routes, going to other forests in the world. And it talks about that some of the forest spirits go out looking for other forests that might also have spirits. Now, one of the things the 8th edition book does that's interesting is it implies that during the early days, so pre-Cataclysm, there were no other spirits to be found. There were the spirits of Athel, and the rest of the world was silent. We know, based on like later lore and later writings, that this will change dramatically after the Cataclysm, when a ton more magic comes into the world, and like that results in like a whole bunch of places kind of getting their own spirits and waking up and doing all this stuff. But in the early days, Athel was kind of alone. The only place that was even close was Avalorn within Ulthuan, which is the beautiful forest at the center of Ulthuan's, like the top part of the center donut. And and in Avalorn, the forest spirits found what was, from their perspective, a similar paradise, which Ulthuan was designed as a paradise for the elves. And so when the forest spirits arrive there, Durthu being among them, they are deeply impressed with Avalorn, and they start hanging out there a lot, trying to nurture Avalorn so that it can gain its own spirits.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's also worth stepping back outside of the Wood Elf lore just a little bit here, because we know certain things were happening in Ulthuan at the time, and the Wood Elf lore, if you focus on that alone, just doesn't discuss this. But we know at the time that Ulthuan is effectively this great island paradise that has been risen up from the depths, and the elves, as far as they're concerned, attribute all of that to their gods, and they're living hand in hand with their gods in the same way that, I don't know, the great forest spirits in Avalorn are living amongst themselves over there too. So there are also great spirits in Ulthuan. So you could argue that what's going on in Ulthuan is not so different to what's going on over in Avalorn, in that there are great, enormous spirits there, because gods are just etheric entities of extraordinary power, and Durthu is one of them. A great spirit of extraordinary power that comes from the trees. And if we look at the elven gods, arguably they're much more powerful, but arguably perhaps they're not as well. There are different lines that we could take. But Ulthuan is very similar in terms of its overall composition to Athel. And again, this is an Old One project. The elves are an Old One project. The great spirits that lead them are an Old One project. So we have got ourselves two Old One projects that meet pre-Cataclysm. And one of those manifestations is Durthu, a great ancient spirit of Athel that through the world roots arise in Avalorn, which, as we've already described, is basically another Athel. That's what it feels like to Durthu. Durthu is at home. There are other probably tree spirits that are there already of some form, because this project is so very similar to what's over there, but they're nothing like Durthu, because Durthu's in a place where he sees that this place is not, let's say, shaped in the same way that the forests back in Athel are, because Durthu, this ancient spirit, can already shape the trees around him. The trees basically follow his lead. And this is something that he then passes over to one of his favorite elves that he meets. And she, as is sadly often the case with her position, is both kind of sidelined in terms of her importance, because she's enormously important to the elves of this time, while simultaneously you don't really realize just how important she is, because she's literally just given a name and a quick, Durthu and her have a chinwag.
Yeah, so in this age, we don't know how long it is, but it's likely a good couple hundred years after Durthu arrives in Ulthuan. And what's fun about Durthu and the tree spirits in general is that they don't have to show themselves. Like, they can just kind of remain in etheric form, where they're much more hard to perceive. And what's fun about this initial story is it's implied that the elves knew something was going on in Avalorn, but they didn't know what, because they couldn't see them. But they could perceive that there was something different about Avalorn compared to everywhere else. So the elves that were the more hippie-ish, like the Everqueen, who being, an aspect of Aisha, and she is a descendant of multiple Everqueens. Like, there have been.
I'll possibly put a different reading there. We don't really know. She could have been the only one. I don't think we've got a strong line of there was lots of Everqueens yet.
I thought in the 8th edition High Elf book it says like that she is part of a line by that point.
Maybe. I don't recall it, but that might be the case. But we are talking at this point pre-Cataclysm, and yeah, I think you might be right in that one. I mean, you want to check it up.
Well, it's because they have the note interesting in the Wood Elf book about what happens in a minute, where like she's like, oh my, I have to get my daughter out of here or else the line will end. Like, it has to be a genetic pass down.
Yeah, which is super fascinating, and really doesn't get a proper answer. You're right.
But we're not there yet.
There's been a few before that. Good point. Anyway,
so
let's not get caught up in the minutiae there.
So Durthu observes the elves for a while, and the thing that he notices is that the elves behave, in his opinion, properly with the forest, where there is blooded life back in Athel, but it's either wild creatures or like other little species that the old ones like didn't care about, or maybe some really, really early experiments of theirs. And the wood elf or the tree spirits had already adapted the relationship that if you hurt the trees, they will hurt you back, which generally does not go well. But the elves were very respectful to the forest, and they spoke to the forest, and they treated it with reverence and care. And over time, Durthu came to like the elves to the point that he started to converse with them and would later reveal himself. And granted, this was not the super scary as hell Durthu we have now. He was much more gentler in aspect, and the elves dubbed him Oakheart. He did not tell them his name. Either that or he said it in like tree speak, and they were like, okay, we're going to call you Oakheart because we can pronounce that. But they dub him Oakheart, and he is very well loved by the elves. And many of the dryads and other forest spirits at this time, other Treeman, come over to Avalorn, also reveal themselves. And eventually, Durthu, along with them, they teach the elves the art of tree singing, which is super interesting because this is an art that the elves will actually lose, which for a while, which is fascinating to think about. That there were elves that knew how to tree sing and maybe developed that into other forms of magic that were passed down, but the actual integral art of tree singing itself gets lost for thousands of years. Which might imply that the actual tree singing part was only taught to a very select few individuals, and even the elves knew they weren't supposed to teach that to other elves until they kind of passed the vibe check with the forest spirits, which is a really interesting thing to think about. But like everything in Warhammer, all good things come to an end.
Indeed, Cataclysm is a coming. I've just checked it, and it doesn't actually say anything concerning the generation, so she could possibly have been the first. Just had a quick read. I don't think that's particularly likely, but it's always worth just clarifying that the source material is not always consistent, and it leaves enough holes for later writers to actually go, actually, it's this. That all aside, the coming of chaos, as we all know, is sitting not just upon the horizon. It comes in with a mighty boom. Now, if you want to know more about that, we've discussed it at length in previous streams. But to cut a long story short, Avalorn, where Durthu is currently residing alongside a great swelling of elves, many of whom are living at one with the forests, they are, after all, in a playground paradise. This is a place where great spirits reside, that gods reside, and I would argue that possibly Isha is not really represented by the Everqueen per se yet. That's something that will come with time, because Isha is still there. Isha is represented by Isha at this early point, because we know that the gods lived hand in hand with the elves at the beginning, and at some point have to hike it out.
Yeah, the Everqueen of this age comes off more like a high priestess with like a very specific relationship with Aisha. Perhaps
I think that
if you want
seems
to get
fair.
heretical, maybe even a daughter. If you want to get a little spicy.
I mean, you could argue with, I think, to get spicy, you could argue that the elven gods at this point are nothing more than the first seeded elves. And that the elves are the literal children of Aisha. After all, she claims to be the mother of all elves. There's lots of spicy arguments you could take if you wish, because as it currently stands, there's no clean answer, and other than the old ones are supposedly responsible for uplifting the elves. But as far as the elves are concerned, that's not the case. They believe themselves to be literal children of the gods. And how does that both manifest? Doesn't really matter for this story, but it's certainly something that's there to be discussed at a later point. What we have instead is a world that suddenly floods full with demons. But before we get onto that, it's also worth saying they don't come anywhere near Avalorn to begin with.
Yeah, that's one of the actually really fun parts, is that most of Ulthuan has a really bad time pretty quick. Like, you know, you kind of have the confusing aspects of like the lizardmen hold off some demons for a while, but whatever. Needless to say, there's like a good 1500 year ballpark where eventually the demons come to Ulthuan, and it's a bad time, except in Avalorn, because the demons are able to sense all of forest spirits, and they look over there and go, those are kind of like us, which means those can hurt us. So we're not going to go over there. Like, we'll take the easy pickings first, and then we'll come over there. So there's like, it's not until the time of Anarion, which Anarion only really pops up in like the last few hundred years of the Cataclysm War. It's not until Anarion has already become Phoenix King. Like, he's already thrown himself into the flame of Shurn and done that whole thing, that the demons finally attack Avalorn. And
that's a long period of time. Don't in any way think this is a short, like, couple of years or something. We're talking centuries of warfare through the Cataclysm. And it eventually comes to an end with, obviously, the deeds of Anarion et al., plus the various other forces around the Warhammer world, all combining to come up with a let's stop chaos plan. All of whom pretty much claim that they were the ones responsible for bringing it to an end, because they've all got individually big heads. But the attack of Avalorn comes relatively near the end of this. So we are dealing with elves in this particular place who are already centuries, if not millennia old. who are almost all individually very powerful. Near the end of the Cataclysm also suggests that the elven gods have gone, which makes one of the reasons for why Avalorn was finally attacked, because the elven gods are no longer there to protect it, which means the only things they've got to protect are the spirits that are there, which again, the demons are pretty shy of, until eventually they go, no, we've got enough. And they don't come in a small number. They come in an enormous horde. Indeed, hyperbole expounds here like mad, where they say it wasn't just a small number of demons, it was one of the biggest hosts of demons to attack anywhere in the Warhammer world up to this point. Now, it's kind of hyperbolic. Almost certainly that's not the case. But that nevertheless gives you an idea of the scale and also the danger that Avalorn pretty much represented. They needed to take this place down, and they go to town.
Yeah, what's interesting here, two things that I find really interesting is that what we were talking about earlier would actually explain a lot. Astariel is the Ever Queen at this point. Yes. And she has a very frantic response, but it makes sense that she is the first Ever Queen since the departure of the Elven Gods, which means that from her perspective, she's probably the last genuine connection to Aisha in that sense, which will heavily explain what she's about to do. But the thing that's also really interesting is that, so this is after Anarion becomes the chosen of Ashurin, the avatar of Ashurin. And one of the things that we talked about, if you go watch our Malekith stream, is that during this time, Anarion was already unstoppable. Like he was beating the snot out of the demons. And the thing is that the demons came to realize that they couldn't beat Anarion. So what they had to do is they had to kill everything else. So Anarion is off on campaign, and while he's gone, Nakari, the big bad, the arch-tempter of Slaanesh, who has already fought Anarion once and got his ass kicked, decides to do the biggest just oof, and he does what Keepers of Secrets does best. He goes after what you love. And so he gathers this huge demon army and just slams right into Avalorn. And like Andy said, this is a huge invasion. Like this is this is probably the biggest invasion of Ulthuan until the final battle at the creation of the Vortex.
No doubts. Absolutely no doubts at all. The cataclysmic battle that is about to come is enough to, well, as we will cover, completely destroy everything that was Avalorn. And think Avalorn as Athel as well. Don't try and think of it or play it down. This is a proper magical place that has been tended by the gods, that has been looked after by the elves. And this is an important part. It has been tended by the elves for some time. And this is something that Durthu, who is going by the name of Oakhart here, doesn't just appreciate. He looks at it and sees it as a good thing. He sees the tending of the forest by the elves as something that has brought benefits to the spirits that are living there. There is a reason that he's hanging out there and he's got his favorite Everqueen pal. It's because it very much matches his own sensibilities. He is, by nature, at least at this point, relatively gregarious. He's relatively slow moving. He's an ancient spirit already, but he's also friendly. He's keen to see them develop. And when he sees them develop, he is delighted by what comes about. And when the place gets attacked, he, and not just the 5 or 6 other spirits here, there are at this point thousands.
Yeah.
Literal thousands. Now, many of them are striplings, basically newborn spirits of the wood, and they have all been brought about because of the tending of the elves. This entirety, Avalorn is so much more than it once was because of the influence of Durthu, and because of the influence of Durthu on the elves, who have now sung this forest into something beautiful, into something that is filled with life and massively full of spirits in a way that it almost certainly wasn't before. They haven't just created a second Athel, they've created arguably a better version of it, because it's something that has got all the power and potential of Athel, plus all of the tending of the elves, who are, by their very nature, also deeply magical creatures. So the taking out of Avalorn is exceedingly important to the forces of chaos, because it's a source not just of hope for the good old elves, it is also a source of extraordinary magic and fear for them, because this is effectively a forest full of hundreds of thousands of demons like them.
Yeah, and what's interesting to also consider about Durthu at this point is that when the Cataclysm starts, the forest spirits, being magical creatures, and granted, everybody was aware when the Cataclysm started, you couldn't miss it. they were immediately aware that, oh shit, stuff's going down. Like, this is bad. And one of the things we get in the Wood Elf book that I love is there's an implication that basically Durthu has a conversation with all of the other forest spirits in Avalorn about, should we go home? Like, surely Athel is under threat. Should we go home and fight? And they all come to the decision of, no, we're going to stay. We're going to stay and we're going to fight and protect Avalorn. He could have gone home to what is, you know, from his perspective, kind of the most sacred site in the world, being his home, Athel, where the Oak of Ages is, but he chooses to honor his alliance with the elves instead and says, you know what? No, we're going to stay. We're going to protect all these elves as long as we can. And if the demons do attack, we're going to help fight back, which is fascinating. It also kind of shows Durthu's character at this point.
It does, and it also shows the importance of Avalorn and the alliance that these spirits had made with the elves there. Athel is the source of wood elves as we know them today. They started here. It's Avalorn in Ulthuan. All of the great stories of the elves start in Ulthuan. In the same way that Nagarai and everything that happens with an Arion is the start of the Dark Elves. The Everqueen and everything that happens with Durthu and the great forest spirits here is the beginning of the Azrai. This is the birth point. It is from here that all of the wood elves and their preferences, their way of living will begin. But it's also worth saying that what happens during this war is frankly awful.
Yeah. So, like we've gone at length to describe how wonderful Avalorn is, you can hopefully take into context the tragedy and the horror that Nakari unleashes on it, where he just obliterates everything in his way. Because they're just endless amounts of demons. So they push all the way in, and although the forest spirits help and fight side by side with the elves, they're dying, and B, one of the things that's interesting about the forest spirits is being etheric creatures. They can be very sensitive to certain kinds of like heightened emotions is probably the best way to describe it. When Avalorn is being burned and twisted and warped, like just think about the perversions of Slaanesh, the warping mutations of Tzeentch, the rot and decay of Nurgle, like all of these things are destroying swaths of Athel. A lot of the spirits just start to go insane. Like they lose themselves to despair. And so the forest spirit numbers are shrinking rapidly. And Durthu realizes they can't stay here. It's not
quite true because he intends to stay. It's not until he's asked not to that he leaves.
He does shepherd a lot of the forest spirits out.
Yeah, quite. I mean, he stays. And it's not until he's asked to by the Everqueen directly to protect the Everqueen's children and protect the royal line of the Everqueen that he eventually agrees to leave, believing that hiking it back to Athel will be safe. And the Everqueen, in turn, believing it will be safe as well, as she then returns to the war, having asked Durthu to do this. And Durthu, after a long time, saying, I will, but. And I think it's a really interesting but. Not because he's got a really nice firm butt, because he, which of course he does, but because he quite clearly states to her, almost in a prophetic way, which is not necessarily the case for his character. He's generally perceived as you view him through his various aspects of his life.
Strong of heart and strong of arm is how
exactly that. Again and again, where the other Treeman are given slightly different character traits. But he very clearly states that that there will be a cost, and it will be a cost for her future generations, which I think is fascinating in and of itself. And the cost will be that they will have to tend the forest of Athel in the same way that Avalorn had been tended by her and all of her court. And this is a cost that Ariel, hearing Durthu's voice, Astariel, pardon me, hearing Durthu's voice, pauses on. And she pauses because she hears a different tone from Durthu, where Durthu had previously been, let's say, a generally nice guy. Here it becomes almost grave, as if this is a real cost. So before you say you're going to do it, you make sure that this is what you want, because they will be bound to me. It's a classic deal between almost, and I want to repeat this potentially. It's almost like a classic deal between a demon and a human.
Yeah.
And it very much comes across like that if you take it away.
It's a
from the fact-
well-meaning demon, but it's
it's
functionally a demon.
effectively a demon, and she makes a deal with a demon, and that deal is in return for saving your children in perpetuity will do to Athel Loren and tend Athel Loren in the same way that you did here over in Avalorn. Eventually, she agrees.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it wasn't just that Durthu decided to be a jerk, and be like, oh well, if you're gonna owe me one, but it was that there was a law that was like deeply put in place by all of the elders of the forest. They all agreed that blooded life could never travel the world routes, never, for any reason. No blooded life, spirits only. To take blooded life would violate the world roots itself, and they likely feared that taking like a living entity of blooded life into the world roots could affect it in some horrible way. It could potentially infect the world tree or the Oak of Ages if they're not careful. And so Durthu, to save Morelian and Yvraine, which are the Everqueen's two children, he would have to violate this law, which is why he's like, I want to do this, but I have to find a way. He's basically doing a cardinal sin. He's breaking like a foundational tenet of his people. So he has to kind of use this almost Faustian bargain as a way to allow, there has to be a price. There's a toll that has to be paid for them to use this road.
Totally. And do think of the world roots a little bit like, or think of our warm-blooded folks as a little bit like a bacteria. As long as you've got the world roots completely sealed off and nothing breaks their cells, then they are completely free of that bacteria. But the second you pierce it and you allow the bacteria in, that closed system has come to an end. What was just the spirits that were allowed in there becomes something different. From this point forwards, once some have moved through, those holes have been made, and that's it. From that point onwards, the world roots will be forever. Now, if you're a spirit, you could argue forever tainted. Now, there is a question there. What does that even mean? How could it be? And I think there is a very easy answer. Material creatures that have got themselves their own psyches, when they move into an immaterial place, they impose material laws around them. They can't help it because they have to see. They have to see stuff. So when they get in there, it's no longer etheric entirely. It has material components. They effectively change everything that they enter into, or you could argue they solidify it. They make it more material. This, effectively, Durthu is coming to a deal that will change the world roots fundamentally forever, from being something that is potential, spirit, emotion, etheric, whatever words you wish to say, to something that has now been witnessed by living creatures, and through that witnessing effectively becomes certain. And who wants certainty when you're a spirit? This is, as deals go, abiding, deep, and also deeply problematic for the spirits that Durthu is about to, and I'm going to call it, betray.
Yeah.
Yeah, but betray because the world is coming to an end, and he's getting something out of it.
Yeah. And Durthu tries to play, and it's also worth noting, Durthu's also trying to play his cards in a way, because he knows when he goes home with these kids, he's going to have to explain himself or these kids will be slaughtered. He's trying really hard to be like, all right, the cost has to be extreme, which is why he pitches this very prophetic and binding pact. That's the other thing, is that this is not like a casual deal that you can just be like, oh, sure. Like the forest will come later and be like, hey, you owe us a third of your children. And you could be like, oh, well, if I refuse, is there a consequence? No, you can't refuse. This is like fate binding type of pact. And Astariel accepts, because frankly, what choice does she have?
Yeah, well, she realizes she has no choice. She literally has no choice. So her children are spirited away by Durthu through the world routes and taken to Athel Loren. Meanwhile, back in Ulthuan, the great war against the demons continues. And I'd like to just quickly call out something here, which is worth saying cleanly. Often the bad guys in Warhammer fail, because ultimately the stories in Warhammer, for all they may be grim and perilous, are often given this edge where the great heroes somehow against all the odds will win, generally at cost, come the end. But that's not what happens in Avalorn. It just isn't.
Yeah.
Avalorn is properly brought to an end. In the Cataclysm, Avalorn is completely razed. So, point 1 to Greater Demon of Slaanesh.
Yeah, and it's also the worst way, because it's not just any demon that gets Astariel. It's Nakari, which is like, it's kind of one of those things that the best way to examine that horror is not to examine it, is to allow the imagination to go, what kind of, like, the spiritual awfulness of that. Like, Astariel's sacrifice is not small.
No, it's not. And indeed, for those of you out there looking to create stuff, Astariel could very well be some form of horrendous greater demon prince by now, given the horrors that almost certainly were inflicted upon that soul. And it will be a massive capture, not just because of the territory taken, but because of all the spirits brought to an end, because of this great representation of everything the old ones were attempting to do through Astariel. This is a proper horrific outcome, and Durthu has chosen to allow it to come to pass by running off with the kids, and he has agreed to do this. Durthu is of a power that he believes he could almost certainly make a difference. He's certainly chosen to hold this place. Again, it's worth noting that there were thousands of greater spirits like him, at least at the beginning of the Cataclysm, but by this point their numbers are significantly smaller, and as we'll find out as we go back to Athel, actually really significantly smaller.
Yep. But before we do that, we're going to get caught up on
Super Chats.
So
Yeah.
Get up, because I know exactly which one, because it was this one.
Yay.
Can we please disable Super Chats? No, because we like to be able to eat food. I understand, but hey, at least they're in the gaps, right? They're in the gaps. How do the Azrae show respect to the forest spirits? They use bow and arrow. Ha.
Although we would say bow here.
Get a wood elf girlfriend. They're good at getting to the root of the problem. You know what? Honestly, I feel like elves, no, they wouldn't. They would know what the problem is, but they dance around it. Are Treeman greater demons of Athel? That is a fair way to think of them.
I would argue that you could go further if you wish to do so. In that there are various levels of etheric entity if you look at it purely from the demonic side, where you've got like the least tiniest demons up to your lesser demons, up towards your greater demons, then arguably your greater princes, your demon princes. Although it's fair to say that demon princes and greater demons sometimes fluctuate, but generally speaking, the demon princes sit above them. And then you've got the gods themselves that sit above that. And I do say gods, Ulthuan confirmed that massively. There is a wide variety of chaos gods, not just the great four that we know today. Now, we flip that over onto the other side. You've got a variety of lesser tiny spirits that very much inhabit Athel and pretty much the entirety of the old world and beyond in a variety of forms. As you move up to your lesser spirits, your lesser demons, your equivalent of your dryads, your naiads, and similar, up towards your greater spirits and greater demons, you could argue the Treeman, and then you move up towards your demon princes, the equivalent level, those that are almost gods themselves. And Durthu is probably around about that area. He's more than just simply a tree man or a greater demon, if you will, of the forest. He is proper ancient.
Yeah, the actual elders, which Durthu is one of, are they're almost in that wiggle room of god tier. Like they Absolutely. Are. I'll put it this way: for the wood elves, the elders like Durthu are on the pantheonic mandala. Like they're on the god chart, which is bonkers to think about.
And I think that very much cleanly states what the world was like back before the Cataclysm. These elder spirits are in many respects equivalent to the elven gods. And don't think that the elven gods were only a handful, like 20 or 30 of them. We have stories of one god slaying like 100 of his children who were all gods in and of themselves. Okay, there were not just a score of gods, there were hundreds, but through the Cataclysm, they got whittled right down to a very small number, and then they hiked it back to the Aether, never to return again. In a similar fashion that Durthu was once a creature that was one of thousands, and those thousands were completely annihilated through the course of the Cataclysm, leaving only, as we're about to cover, very few left.
Holy Artist, power and age-wise, who's stronger, Durthu or Codale? They're equal. The story goes kind of very out of its way to suggest they're pretty much equal. Durthu is maybe implied to be a little stronger when it comes to like physical fighting because he's like just strong. But Codale is said to be extremely cunning, is like his particular theme.
And it's also worth noting that these spirits, when they die, their spiritual essence do not go anywhere. Now, there's the suggestion that if you are killed by something that is a great spiritual entity, they might take your power. But loosely speaking, when it comes to the wood elf spirits, it's stated in a couple of places that the Treemen, as they die, their power goes through the roots up into the other Treemen, meaning that effectively the remaining great spirits have the power of all of the other great spirits that died contained within them. So not only is Durthu a great spirit of great age, he's one that's increasingly grown more and more and more powerful as time has gone by. He is effectively a god.
Yeah, that one of the most fascinating things about the elders is they are kind of treated as almost this living entity that when you cut off one of its heads, all of the energy that was going to that head is now siphoned to all of the others instead. It has to, you cut off that flow so the water redirects to the other paths. So the less ancients there are, or not ancients, the less elders there are, the more powerful the remaining elders become, which will become a huge thing later.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to view it in super simple terms, the elders of Athel are effectively the gods of trees.
Yeah.
That's a really simple way of putting it. And the elven gods are the gods of the elves. And the elven gods, as they were whittled down, that didn't change the nature of elves, their magical nature and how they influence the aether. So the power of all the elves still goes to them, in the same way that the power of all the forests still goes to the ancients that are the gods of the wood. And just because there's no longer as many doesn't mean that the power just fritters away. All of the power now just goes to the very few that remain. And interestingly, what would happen if they should die? Well, that's a question.
Yep. Mr. Pig, what kind of campaign is most popular among the Treeman Aggressors? Haha. CB4N, are we going to discuss Durthu's close friend, business partner, and healthcare proxy, Criminal of the Salon today? He's very important to the story. Not today. Nope. He's too busy whacking off.
I think we should definitely spend at least 5 minutes on Kremlin.
No, Mr. Pig, would you say Durthu is pining for the old times? He
is. Bless him.
Finnebar, Erla, Tyrion, Malekith, Carl Franz, Orion, even Durthu now. Damn, Alariel, you go, girl. I don't know why you have an interesting reverse harem for Alariel. Jonathan Scott, what type of tree is Durthu? A weeping willow. Jesus, guys. Niles, do you think there is a do you think there is a world route link with the jungles of Koresh? If so, what do you think the Blood Naga are doing with it, or are the Wood Elves blocking them thanks to the streams? So something that's really interesting that we probably won't discuss with Durthu because it doesn't really matter for later in the story is that world routes can wither. If there's too much corruption or dark magic, they will kind of become poisoned and they'll kind of wither away. And eventually the Wood Elves learn to close them off so that they don't risk polluting the actual Oak of Ages. So if the Naga, it depends on what the Naga are like. If they're kind of following the stories we see in like the Monstrous Arcanum, where they're using like blood magic and really scary dark sorceries, their world route is probably cut off. I mean, more than likely.
The world routes, these great paths through the aether, are particularly tasty and enticing to creatures like beastmen et al. And that's probably because Chaos is looking to completely cut them off and ruin the realms that lie down there, because they're not just simply routes. There's entire places you can go in there. It's a little bit like the webway from 40k. It's not just simply passages through the warp or passages through the aether. It contains its own places where great spirits still reside, where ancient elves still live, and as the sources of these routes are killed, all of the attendant, let's say, locations held within there also get destroyed. So when the beastmen infiltrate and take it all and destroy it, they destroy all those extra places that were down there too. So if the Blood Naga end up coming out as effectively bad guys, almost certainly those routes will either have withered, been sealed off, or somehow closed. If they haven't, then almost certainly those world routes will still be open.
Yep. And there would definitely be a world route to the jungles of Koresh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Mr. Pig, when asked what kind of trees he wants planted, Durthu said, birch, please. Can I continue going, or is he going to drive you barking mad? Hey, I'll always take $5 to read a story.
Yeah, I mean, we're never going to complain, ever.
Respect for Durthu's booty? Yep, big respect. Yep. Who's
Definitely.
Durthu's favorite actor? Chris Pine.
Chris Pine.
He needs... What's Durthu's best feature? He has a great ash. Thinking about it in retrospect, Nakash had some good ideas. I feel like, oh man, I need a nihilist character in a Wolfrip campaign who just has a moment where he goes, like, just sees people doing something and he's just like, maybe Nagash was right. Like, maybe we should all just die. Finally caught you guys live. If I was a few weeks ago and I've been listening to you guys on your podcast almost every evening since. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Super appreciated.
Thank you.
That was lovely.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan Woodall, I asked this before, but I want Andy's take as well. Is Durthu capable of taking on the greater named demons of chaos, such as Nakari and Scarbrand? Could he have been able to stop Nakari and Ulthuan during the Cataclysm? Yes. Yeah, he could have.
Yeah, I very much think that the removal of Durthu from that battle impacted the likelihood of Avalorn's survival. He is a genuine loss. He is one of the oldest spirits that exist. In fact, eventually becomes pretty much the oldest spirits that exist. Is a power level akin to almost God. And Kari, particularly during the Great Cataclysm, Nakari is effectively the same. Enormously powerful. It would have been a titanic conflict. But I think it's also probably worth saying that Nakari is largely mentioned there because it's always good to personify this attack. So we can immediately say, aha, it is the demon what does hate the elves that has arrived. It probably wasn't the only one. There will have been many, many, many others. It's just the one that got name dropped. As someone came in and went, hey, Nakari was here. Donk. There will be a variety of others as well.
Yeah, Durthu could Durthu have stopped Nakari? Probably. Like, it would have been a battle with the Titans. He might have won, but it would have been a small island of victory among a sea of loss. Yeah, and it wouldn't have ultimately mattered because there were just so many demons.
And it's worth saying that at this point, there was probably a bunch of other really old spirits there. Again, younger than Durthu, but that were staying and were continuing to fight. It was never going to be an easy fight for Chaos. It's why Chaos brought everything to the table. They absolutely wanted to win. And ultimately they did. And the loss of creatures like Durthu and probably others, because there's going to be more than one tale. The tale that we have from the Wood Elf Army list concerning this, which is mirrored over in the High Elf Army list as well, is just one tale amongst literal thousands. Every one will make an impact on the outcome of this battle, but it's the big important one because of the influence that it has upon the foundations of what the elves will be.
Yeah, but Durthu versus literally any named character in the setting is pretty much a fair fight.
Yeah.
Or a total stomp in Durthu's favor. Jonathan Scott, what does it look like when the sentient forest is corrupted? Do the spirits die or become demons? Also, is it just Nurgle who desires the forest? Magic is desired by demons. It doesn't matter what kind of magic. So, like, even Korn has use for forests. So does Slanesh. So does Tzeentch. They could twist it. So do any god, really. There are lots of gods that desire forests and will make them into their own image. Now, as far as what would it look like when it's corrupted, it depends on the nature of the corruption. You could argue that Drycha is corrupted. She's still a forest spirit, but she's a really nasty, mean one. Like, she is the textbook definition of malevolence. Coadil has literally been corrupted by the blood of Morgar. He's still recognizably a Treeman ancient looking thing, but he is deeply corrupted. It would just depend on the nature of the corruption.
Yeah, chaos is not consistent. So if we're looking at something like chaos being the corrupting influence here, it is going to be beyond your wildest, most lurid imaginations, or alternatively, a techno horror burn down as Korn comes through with his brass engines. There's all manner of different ways that this place could be corrupted, and I would suggest that rather than pin it down with a couple of relatively flaccid adjectives,
use your imagination.
Yeah, quite. Use your imagination and then go further, because it's going to be proper crazy. Again, if you're looking for ideas, go check the Chaos books. There's lots of ideas in there about how chaos may manifest. Some of the older novels and short stories that came around during the 80s and 90s, they tend to dial in some of the crazier chaos bits a little bit more. They may be worth a look. Or again, because ding, 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 go to the books of Michael Moorcock. The books of Michael Moorcock constantly describe chaos and the enormous effect that they have upon the material realm.
I flipped between bow and arrow and taking a bow. I think bow and arrow was better for.
Yeah, it was pretty good, Mr. Pig. Thanks.
Are there equivalents of Treeman elders in other regions, such as the Ancient Widow, Triton, and Royal Jin? Kind of, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, looking at it on its, again, simplest terms, if we have got ourselves great spirits that have come about because of the magical thing in the world, Durthu is one of those. The magical thing being the trees, the outcome being the great elder spirits. The magical thing being the elves, the outcome being the elven gods. The magical thing being Kislev, the outcome being arguably the Ancient Widow, Mother Kislev, whatever you wish to call it. So are there other things that are somewhat equivalent across the Warhammer world? Yes. All manner of effectively spirits that reach almost greater demon to godlike levels.
Yeah, and it reaches even kind of like silly levels of like, you think about like, oh, well, what about bears? Well, yeah, then you got like Urson or like predators. You got lupus. Like there are gods that represent like creatures and things. So the answer is essentially yes. Mr. Pig, Durthu's favorite vacation, a trip to the beach.
Hey, Mr. Pig.
He needs a vacation. R&R, could tree spirits exist in non-traditional forests? Could we have an ancient Treeman palm tree? Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The what brings them about is the magical natures of the forest at hand. So we've got ourselves a big magical palm tree forest. The answer is not just yes, the answer is certainly. If it's a spiritually dead location, then no great spirits are going to be coming about from it. Having said that, though, we know from all of the real world Eastern traditions that all of their, let's say, surrounding environment are filled with spirits, and Games Workshop tends to copy paste at least those sort of core ideas when they go forward. So all of our Eastern, which includes many areas with palm trees, almost certainly have spirits of a variety of different kinds. And as we go west over into the equivalent of the New World, Nagaroth, Lustria, and all the rest of it, there are going to be some form of equivalence everywhere unless they have been somehow shut down.
Yeah, so yeah, like a good example is like Lustria is very magically saturated because the Slann literally drew magic into the continent itself to make it more dangerous. There would definitely be what you would identify as forest spirits in Lustria that would be very spooky.
Indeed, they are the sort of things that would exist, and normally the role-playing game would go into great depth, picking out individual examples that are so very unlike what you get inside the battle game, because the battle game focuses upon the armies from each area, and these things are normally not army-based because they are often antagonists to the armies, because they are perhaps a spirit of the wild that stands separate to the civilization of the pyramids, for example. So they would be acting as an antagonist, so thus never hit an army. So that's the sort of area where you hope that the roleplay game will jump in and say, well, the Warhammer world is this. We need to represent what the Warhammer world is in its greater party in this local area. So definitely.
It was popular, not populist. I'm sorry I messed up your joke. Would the petrified forest have tree spirits? It would depend on what petrified ends up meaning when you're actually there. If it means that it's literally like a dead wood where there's no magical resonance and everything's quite literally dead, then no, there wouldn't be spirits.
But I think you could make yourself some really fun undead Treeman-alike creatures from that sort of area. And I think it would be almost a shame not to dial into that if you were a content creator looking for building something in that area where you could build yourself some truly horrible, ancient, almost monochrome, black and white, burning red eyes with the coals of fire in their eyes. Oh, it'd be awful.
There is some beautiful, horrifying artwork from the Monstrous Arcanum, or I think it's either the Monstrous Arcanum or it's the Storm of Magic book. I think it's the Storm of Magic book, actually. That there's a wizard, and I think in Astalia, who invented, though whether or not he's the first to ever try it, he invented RBO necromancy, so the resurrection of dead trees. It did not go well. It did not go well for him or anyone else that has tried it. But it has some horrifying artwork of an undead tree eating people. Communism Incorporated. Durthu's days of smoking trees with the queen and making spirit babies with the elves got ruined by the ultimate killjoy Nakari. Is it possible for Durthu to have corrupted chaos with life? Well, you have to remember that the line between what is chaos and what is Durthu is a weird, wiggly, fuzzy thing.
Yeah, so I think that this comment is actually fascinating for what it suggests because it's something that is written about in more than one place, and that's that elves often took spirits for spouses. This pops up in more than one place. Certain ancient naiads were said to have been married to elves, and Durthu very well possibly was. Now, as much as this may sound a bit odd, but the lover of the Everqueen. It seems very likely to me, given the nature of the
Super
story.
likely, yeah.
And given everything that comes out, it's not said, it's not explicitly mentioned, but if I were writing it, it would be the case. Don't just think of these great tree spirits as the miniatures that we know. The dryads are often represented with actual elves. They come out giggling from the forest, looking like elves, and the same can be said probably for any of the ancient spirits. They are not fixed.
Yeah.
They are shapeshifters.
The tabletop minis in the art are just the war aspect. They have
absolutely.
They can take other forms that are.
They are shapeshifters to their core.
Much
and
less.
And their war aspect, as they put up, is a part of their shapeshifting as the spirit takes on a different form.
Oh,
so
I actually like that a lot because that would make the tragedy of Durthu having to leave that much heavier, which would
and it breaks his heart as well. It's just beautiful, and he does it not necessarily because. He does it out of love. Yeah. He does it because he has been begged and he's got to leave behind that which he loves. It's a horrible story. I think that is beautiful and should definitely be the case.
Yep. Laughing God. More serious topic. I know that many ancients died, Durthu eventually being the last, but is it possible for more ancients coming to being born / created either by the ether or passage of time?
So the answer to that is no.
Yeah,
because the important word there is ancients or elder. Now, can you get more Treeman? Yes, more striplings, as they're often referred to, younger ones popping up and then slowly but surely manifesting power over time. But none of them will be the ancients in the same way that the Slan later generations will never be the ones that were right there at the very beginning.
Mazdamundi can't turn into a first generation Slan, no matter how
absolutely. He's always going to be Mazdamundi. Now, does that mean that over time, Mazdamundi doesn't get bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better? Well, yes, he certainly does. And the same is going to be the case for some of the Treemen that were around, for example, near the end of the Cataclysm. And they will have been living for thousands of years comes the modern day, but they're still never going to be Durthu. They just can't be because Durthu is so much more ancient than them.
Yep. Holy Artist, so the magic in Lustria that makes the force more powerful would have affected Durthu and skin. If there are spirits in Lustria, that spell would have likely affected. But more powerful, I don't think is a very good description. You have to think of it as more like violent, more aggressive. Like if there are 4 spirits there, they would probably be very nasty and borderline if you were comparing them to Durthu, borderline feral.
Yeah, I mean, if you there is a very weak line between demon and spirit. A very weak line. And I think it's fair to say that many of what the world may present as spirits would be perceived by someone like Durthu as effectively just demons. Now, does that mean they're chaos demons? No, it means that they are antagonists. They are those that do not ascribe to Durthu and his more, let's say, highly intellectual level. These are far more, I think, feral is a great word. They are creatures in comparison to the sentience that comes from Athel and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's kind of like the big shining thing that makes the Athel spirits typically unique is their level of sentience.
Absolutely.
They're
basically gods.
Yeah, Morning Crest, I love this. Bonsai Treeman from Nippon, which, I love the design, but also the idea that the Nipponese might be tending to forest spirits like someone tends to a bonsai tree, where they carefully cultivate its growth and they have this relationship with the trees that would kind of mirror the relationship the elves have to Athel, but it would be different because of how humans do it would be different, where these trees allow them to use tools or methods to preen them and, protect them and make them beautiful in a different way. If you were to explore Nippon with an RPG thing, that I would be all over this shit.
Yeah, Warhammer has got a long history of creating very weird familiars, and this definitely feels like a tiny little.
Oh yeah, bonsai familiar. Yeah.
Little bonsai familiar, definitely. Okay, little tree familiar that sits in the corner creaking away, beautiful, and then goes up to its pot and sinks itself down with its roots. That's just beautiful. So the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. Holy Artist, what's the name for a wood elf scholar or herbologist? Okay. Mediosaurus. Do we know anything about the relationship of the lizards and the inhabitants of Athel? Barely anything. The only the loosest connection I can give you is that the Storm of Magic brought back the Zotes and introduced the Zotes as guardians of the deep forest, and they're very heavily, and we know they live in Athel because Wood Elves seek them out for tutelage. And the Zotes are very heavily implied to be an Old One created species, and there's a mention that there's some kind of relationship between them and the Slann, but the book goes out of its way to say the Slann won't comment on what it is. So
no comment.
Yeah.
Ooh, no,
it's like
no.
goofy comment because like who's interviewing the Slann about Zotes, and the Slann are like, no.
Well, inquiring minds want to know, Mr. Slann. Tell me exactly what is your relationship to the Zotes? Oh, no comment, no comment. I had nothing to do with the Zotes or their children. Definitely not.
I don't have any illegitimate sons. Get out of my house.
No,
but, I'm not paying alimony. Be gone. But yeah, so there is some kind of relationship there, but it seems that when you're like, if you think of it as like, okay, Lord Croak, we know was involved with Ulthuan and taught some of the early ancestors of the elves how to use magic. He was in charge of that particular project. It seems like the Zotes were maybe in charge of the Athel project, but you know, the Slann just weren't. So for them, they just don't think about it because that's someone else's job. The thing about the Slann that's actually kind of interesting, that is kind of disappointing about them sometimes, they don't tend to think, or they don't tend to dwell on things that are not pertinent to their version of the Great Plan. And it's likely they have very few notes on Athel other than it's supposed to exist, and if everything's going fine, it'll take care of itself.
Yeah. After all, that's the whole point of the Great Plan. So, yeah, agreed completely.
And then Singemeister, do we know why Naggaroth is so cold compared to the equivalent latitudes elsewhere? Did it manage to not get terraformed properly by the old ones?
I would loosely say that it's so cold because it's so far frickin' north. Take a look at Naggaroth on the map, and it's really, really far north.
Way up there. Like,
okay, if you want to look for an excuse for why, say, parts of the old world that look similarly longitudinal, just look at the real world. We've got the transatlantic flow moving up and keeping Britain warm. There's almost certainly ocean currents that are doing similar jobs over in the Warhammer world, but worse, because it's the Warhammer world. We dialed up to 11, and it'll probably have chaos beasties flying through it or something equally awful. But loosely speaking, it's not so different from the real world here, and I see no reason why it needs to have anything particularly special. It's the correct temperature for approximately where it is in the world. You could argue that parts of the old world are actually the exception, not the other way around. And if we then move over to Kislev, that's the exception. But again, Kislev has a reason for being the way that it is.
Yep. Hammond, Durthu, I did not have sexual relations with that elf.
Except you did.
Except you probably totally did. All right. So, continuing on with the story. So, where we left off, Durthu, thank you for all the support, guys, by the way.
That's really amazing. Thank you so much.
So Durthu comes back home to Athel. And what's interesting is Durthu has not been since the Cataclysm started, like before the Cataclysm started. So when he gets home, it's kind of a shock because initially what Durthu sees is that Athel has gone from spanning almost the entirety of Bretonnia, maybe even over the mountain ranges, to it has been razed and burned to just this little squish between the mountains, kind of where modern day-ish Athel is. Maybe a teeny tiny bit smaller.
I find this actual section quite fascinating because it speaks to just how deep the roots Durthu had placed into Avalorn. He was no longer at all in communication with Athel. The war had been going on for ages, and it was not his concern. The fact that he's come back to Athel and it was a shock tells you a lot about Durthu and what his concerns were. Could he have gone through the world routes? Almost certainly, yes. Could he have had a chat with him over there? Yes. So we've got this feeling that just didn't occur, either to him or from any of the others over there. It also speaks to a certain slow nature for the Treeman spirits.
Yeah, when they put down roots, literally, they get very entrenched.
Yeah, absolutely. And they get fixed in where they currently are. So his arrival there for him, again, just to make sure it's super clear from what was said, it's an absolute shock. Absolutely surprising. And there is a deep and immediate concern that the deal that had been made with the good old Everqueen is perhaps just a fool's errand, because the kids are going to be in as much danger in Athel as they were back in Avalorn.
Speaking of the kids, one of the things that actually reinforces a really cool point Andy made earlier about that if a person like us were to go into the world routes, our attempting to understand it, because we just can't help it, being mortal creatures, would potentially force it to start obeying the laws of reality and fix certain things in place, which would be really bad. Durthu is really cautious. Like, he puts Morellian and Yvain into a slumber they cannot wake from. Like, he knocks them out. Then he takes them to the world route so they don't actually see any of it. They actually won't wake up for this entire experience.
I do find this whole section really interesting as well, because the nature of Durthu's capabilities when it comes to magic are broad and massive in terms of how much control he has around the wood around him, how much control he has on things like the world roots, how much magic he's got with just simple stuff like knocking them out for a few decades. He is not a wuss when it comes to magic. And this is one of the big disparities that you often find between the descriptions of what they can do in the lore and the realities of what they can do in the game. Because in the game, he's only a level 1 wizard.
They do circle back around to it.
They do later. A little bit, but even so. But there's a reason why he's that in the game. And it's pure game balance, because he's already so freaking hard that if you gave him the magic that he probably should have, that his character would be so powerful that you couldn't field an army with him. You'd just have a character, and the only way to play someone else would be to have such a huge army to compensate for that single Treeman that can do literally everything.
Yeah. So Durthu goes home, and like we said, initially he's like, "Oh shit, this is bad." But as he starts to talk with the other spirits, he finds out it's not actually as bad as it looks, in that the demons had eventually attacked Athel Loren over the course of these 1,500 years, and it had been ground back. But the spirits of Athel Loren had started to adapt. They had started to change, and they became more warlike. They became more violent and vicious to match the aggression of the demons. And they evolved their war aspects that we're now familiar with, where they became these spiky, taloned tree creatures that can rip apart men with ease. And the Treeman are like shooting out strangle roots that can impale people and rip other demons apart and all this stuff. And the forest, the thing that's amazing. So think about this. This is before the Cataclysm ends. So the vortex hasn't happened yet. The fighting is still ongoing. Athel Loren had not only the spirits had not only ground the demons' advances to a halt, so they'd actually managed to stop the demonic. Like, they were fighting so aggressive the demons couldn't destroy any more of Athel Loren. Athel Loren was expanding, like they were pushing the demons back. Which this is the demons at their absolute height as far as the Cataclysm goes, which goes to show how fucking scary the Athel Loren spirits were at the end of the war.
And I think this also goes to show the nature of what Athel Loren and those spirits are. In some regards, I would say, ding, 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 let's separate ourselves slightly from all of this and say, what's going on here? And what's going on here is we have a great plan. And the great plan is for the Warhammer world not to end here. It just isn't. And that means that, yes, some parts of it are going to collapse entirely, but other parts are going to thrive. And in this case, Athel Loren starts to thrive. Now, the first question is, what? Why? It's being assaulted by everything all around. And it's because it's housed by, I'm going to use a different word to what we normally use, demons. The entire thing is protected by etheric entities, and you could just call those demons if you wish to do so. And these demons, much like the demons that were assaulting them, were adapting. If we go to other sources, you find that the chaos gods and the first demons that assault the world aren't necessarily the demons that we know and love today. They adapt and change as well as they become far more vicious over the course of the initial campaign. Similarly, the forest are doing the same, and the demons of the forest are coming to their own. And the only way that Athel Loren is really going to fall is if the concentration of all of the forces of chaos go towards them. But they have hundreds, no, thousands of war fronts across the world as they're attempting to bring it down. And in most places, they're doing pretty well. But here, they're doing the opposite, and they're beginning to, dare I even say it, lose.
Yeah, but this all gets interrupted really quickly when all the forest spirits suddenly notice that Durthu brought baggage with him. and he reveals the two children, and it does not go over well. He predicted the reaction that was the one thing that didn't surprise Durthu. And what he's kind of alarmed to discover is that although the Wood Elves are starting to push back, or the Forest Spirits, there has been a horrible price, which is that where there used to be hundreds, maybe thousands of elders, now there are 3. There's Durthu, Adenhu the Wise, who's gifted with prophecy, and Coadil the Cunning, who's...
Although it's worth saying, given the Celtic pronunciation, you could easily pronounce it Coathil, because DD is often pronounced as a th. So it could very be Coathil in the original speaking, but something that has been translated or transliterated over as Coadil.
Yeah. So there are now 3 of them left, which, because of what we talked earlier with the whole thing of when an elder dies, the others get more powerful, means these 3 are immensely powerful spirits.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Adanu the Prophet is basically a seer god. You've got Durthu the Strong, who's basically a warrior god. And then you've got good old Coadil, Coathil, whatever, the Cunning, who's basically a trickster god.
Yeah.
And they are immensely powerful now.
Yeah. And basically what happens is an argument breaks out. Coadil, who at this point, his adaptions to deal with the demons have made him particularly nasty. He's not evil. It goes out of its way to suggest Coadil is not evil by any means, but he is aggressive and he is spiteful. And Coadil looks at these and says, nope, you broke the rules. We got to kill them. And Adenhu initially agrees, but Durthu does not back down. He literally acts like a tree, plants his roots for the argument, and he debates and debates and debates.
Actually, to begin with, the pair of them argue, and Durthu says nothing.
No, that's later.
Yeah. Is that here?
No.
That's the later part. No, you're right.
Yeah,
no, you're right.
yeah.
They shout. No, you're right. I'm getting the 2 books mixed up.
Yeah. So
I retreat.
No, you're all good. So Durthu and these 2 arguing, and over the course of the argument, Adenhu, probably due to prophetic things, because Adenhu probably initially is like, nope, you broke the rules. But as Durthu kept arguing, Adenhu probably was like, all right, let me actually look at this and think about it. And what's fascinating is the book actually gives us Adenhu's point of view, essentially his argument, which Adenhu has a really interesting point, which is Adenhu comes to the decision that the elves should be allowed to stay only because of Durthu's bargain. Because what Adenhu decides is that when he looks at Athel Loren, what it has become in order to survive the demons, he is disturbed. He's worried that the forest is becoming so aggressive, so malign, that they very well to survive may become just as bad, if not worse, than the demons themselves, which is interesting because it really illustrates that Adenhu has a very strong moral compass about like what is right versus what is wrong, which Durthu seems to have as well. Coadil, not so much. Coadil is more about we do what we must to survive. That's all that matters, which is personality-wise very interesting for the 3 of them. And Adenhu ends up switching sides. Which
I'll add a little bit of extra to that, actually.
Yeah,
I'd suggest that all 3 of them are very much of the opinion that they do what they need to survive. It's just it manifests in very different ways. Because they are making exceedingly difficult choices, and all of them realize that they have to make these choices, and that is where the debate comes from. But ultimately, what becomes the heart and soul of not just the tree men and the very spirits, but the wood elves afterwards, is this concept of bunkering down. Survival is the paramount issue. So I would suggest that all 3 of them very much epitomize that view. That's bunkering down, setting down roots view, but with just different lines to their argument.
Yeah. So Adenhu switches sides, and he comes to the agreement that, you know what, the kids can stay and your bargain stands. So it ends up being a 2v1 vote. And Coadil is very upset about it, but he follows the agreement. Like he's angry about it, he yells, but he ultimately doesn't like do anything. And so the children sleep, Athel Loren continues to fight, and then the cataclysm ends, and Durthu very quietly goes back to Athel Loren after the war is over, just a few years after, and he puts Morellian Yervain in the Gaian Vale, which you'll be familiar with if you play Total War Warhammer, and then he leaves. Yeah, and he allows them to wake up, but they don't see him, other than they wake up, and as far as they remember Oakheart like coming towards them to take them away, and that's it. That's all they remember.
And you will recognize this general use of magic and general employment of how to, let's say, skip time in pretty much all of the elven fae tales that are about to come from Athel in the coming centuries later. The idea of spiriting people away and for time passing and coming back, and they have no concept at all of how much time has passed. You can see that this has its heart right in with the ancient spirits of the wood that will be influencing and being influenced by the elves that will come to live there later. This is basically core wood elf traits already being demonstrated, but not by the wood elves, but by the very spirits that the wood elves surround themselves by.
Yeah. So from here, we get a pretty hefty time skip, because at this point, basically, Athel just slowly keeps expanding, and that's really all that happens. Durthu goes back to tending his groves and living in Athel, and however, there is an interesting note that some of the forest spirits do go back to Avalorn to live there, because their hope is to one day make it as good as it used to be, which it's kind of implied that they ultimately are not successful. It'll never be what it was, but they do go back and help regrow it, which is why to this day, you can still find forest spirits very often lounging, some of the actual Athel forest spirits lounging around Avalorn.
Yeah, and they don't look any different than elves half the time as well. So if you were to just happen to arrive there, it'd be a bunch of elves, and then some of them giggle off and run into trees, and you're like, you say what now? What? And should you be someone who shouldn't be there, out comes the war aspect as out it comes. So yeah, Avalorn effectively becomes an Athel -1, because it no longer has the great deep wood that had survived over an Athel. It is basically replanted, so it is always going to be younger. It's always going to have less than Athel does, because Athel has got its ancient deep roots, and of course the Oak of Ages sitting at the very heart of it, that will always make it bigger and more than Avalorn could ever now be. Now, if Avalorn had survived, its trees would almost certainly be as ancient, and possibly it would have made a realm as weird and as crazy as Athel, but that's not the case. If anything, what we've got instead is just normal wood elves that end up kicking about, living over in Avalorn. And the idea that high elves are actually wood elves is something that Games Workshop often forgets, because it does kind of mince up their nice, clean differentiation between their factions.
Yeah, if you're ever playing like a tabletop Avalorn army, you should basically just play wood elves with handmaids of the Everqueen added.
Yeah, pretty much.
Basically playing Avalorn.
Because you're basically playing an Avalorn, you're playing a wood elf army with the Everqueen.
Yeah, which is why in Total War it's awesome. You can recruit forest spirits from the Gain Vale, which is good. So that kind of brings that age to an end. We next pick up with Durthu just doing, they're just growing the forest and doing things.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying one other thing as well, just because that time skip, for all that it's quite clear from the books, is a big space of nothing. Nothing really occurs that they go into any depth in that entire area. But for Durthu, this is time. This is something that he has a yawning amount of ahead of him, and he has got a completely different world to the one that he had before, where beforehand he was one amongst at least hundreds, possibly thousands of elders. He is now almost alone, walking through Athel by himself almost, with just a couple of peers, one of whom's close to hating him, another one who really doesn't like what he did, and a bunch of much younger spirits all around them, all of whom are almost certainly capering away, doing their stuff, and in such a separate way to him. He has already become a figure that is very lonely, very separate from those that are his peers, and if you run with our suggested story, with a broken heart as well.
He's a lot to grieve.
He is deep in grief, and he's a tree. This isn't grief that goes away over the course of a century. So throughout the course of this time, he is just a sad, lonely tree. It is not a good time for the poor chap.
Yeah, and it's only about to get way worse.
It's about to get hugely worse. But we do the few super chats that we have.
Yeah, sure, we can catch up on that real quick.
Yeah, there's not too many of those. I think. Where was the last ones?
The last one
There's
was
Cataclysm
not that one.
Incorporated.
Yep.
The one just after it. That's it.
Imagine a reef and seaweed abyssal demon spirit that almost assuredly exists. It's probably fucking nightmarish.
Yeah, that would be really nightmarish. Nice one. I'd quite like to see that one drawn.
Athel Loren's demons thrive on the very same magic that fuels chaos, or are they having sort of a tug of war with chaos over who gets to manifest?
That's a complicated question.
Yeah, that is
because there's more to it than just the magic itself. It's often marked down that the winds of magic are nothing more than chaos because they come swooping in from the chaos gates. It makes sense. Potentially also seeping in from various other smaller gates across the world in a variety of different ways. But in truth, if we try and take away our very much Sigmar goggles and just view it for what it is, this is not, strictly speaking, just chaos. It's etheric energies, perhaps unleashed on the world in a way that they shouldn't have been, perhaps more material than they once were, but they're certainly etheric energies. So they are definitely sharing some of the power that has flooded through the world during the Cataclysm. But there is also the trees themselves, which are somehow gathering through their big long ley lines, perhaps through their connections to the geomantic web, which it is stated in a couple of places they definitely have. So they are drawing magic up into Athel Loren in a very different way too. So they're not only benefiting from that great swell of magic that has flooded the world, but they're also benefiting from the great flood of magic that they themselves can draw upon, which is why I think near the end of the Cataclysm, they are at the point where they're in the Ascendants. The reason they weren't in the Ascendants from the beginning was because they weren't warlike. It's that simple. They were trees. But come the end of it, they have been changed. And you could say that that is a corruption, or you could just simply say that is the next step in their evolution, depending upon exactly where you want to lay the great plan in all of this.
Yeah, and it's really, there's not a lot of great specific information about like how manifestation works, in the sense of like how much magic you need in the area for a demon to manifest, and if a demon manifests, does that suck up all that magic and therefore no other demons can manifest, or is it like, how do they determine who's going to manifest and who doesn't? That's a super interesting question that actually doesn't have a ton of information. You kind of have to do a lot of between line looking. But
and I would suggest, because it is magic, that it's also not consistent. That is part of it. It's a little bit like almost all the Games Workshop games that have the winds of magic generally have you roll dice to determine how much magic there is around, and you're all sucking on it in a variety of different ways. But equally, even the costs are sometimes randomized, so it's basically somewhat random.
Bit of a crapshoot.
Yeah, a bit of a crapshoot. And I see no reason why you should necessarily want to pin it down and just simply say, oh, it's this, which means they'd get this much and they'd get this much. No, it's this, which means almost anything could happen. Let's see.
Yep. Beer Freckle, thank you so much. Sean Schultz, is there a world fruit in the kelp forests of the ocean? Would that mean they have contact with the fishmen? I would not say it's impossible.
That is an interesting line. That is an interesting line. Kelp forests are quite different to trees. Now, do they have their own spirits within them? Probably. Exactly how do they manifest? Who knows? Were they planted by the old ones? Who knows? There's lots of weirdness there that could certainly be plumbed if they ever decide to go down that particular route.
That would be a fun route to explore.
Yeah, I agree. It'd be super fun.
A Michael Moorcock stream next. I'd have to actually read them.
There are so many books. Michael Moorcock was prolific. He didn't just write one or two; he wrote like 100 or so. Literally loads of them. I mean, he's almost. At one point, he almost wrote a book for Games Workshop. But let's just say that the relationship there was very sour, because Games Workshop basically took all of his worlds, took all of his ideas and claimed them for their own. They did things like copyright the Sign of Chaos, a symbol that he made up.
I was going to say, in the modern world, if like Games Workshop had started existing now, with the way the world is now, they probably would have gotten sued into oblivion.
Because of what they did. But they were also a license at that point to Michael Moorcock. They were licensed through Citadel Miniatures to make miniatures for them. They were also licensed to make the Stormbringer game that was sitting in the back. Stormbringer game was a role-playing game inside the worlds of Michael Moorcock. So they were creating stuff for his worlds, and when they made their own stuff, they just used their existing miniatures and ported them in. So it's almost an inevitability, but there's a whole lot.
Do you have a favorite one, Andy?
Interested too. Yes, the Eternal Champion.
There you go. Y'all should interview Michael Kirkbride. I don't know who that is.
Well, we should definitely interview him then.
Yeah, sure. Yep. All right. So, continuing on with where we come back to Durthu, is that unfortunately for Durthu, we do not come back to him because he's like doing great or having a really good time. It's that there is a theme that gets introduced with Durthu that I like a lot. It's very tragic and it plays a lot into what Durthu becomes, which is that Durthu's bargain with the elves came at a price he did not anticipate, which is that the elves unintentionally will bring danger to Athel Loren. And the first time we really see this start to happen is the War of Vengeance, where the war breaks out between the elves and the dwarves. And before the war, when the elves came to the old world, they felt drawn to Athel Loren. It was a spooky place. They generally stayed out of it because Athel Loren was not super friendly to outsiders. But they wouldn't necessarily, like sometimes elves would disappear. But a lot of the times, the forest, the spirits would use the paths of the forest to just redirect you out of it. So you'd walk into the forest and you'd walk in a straight line, and suddenly you find yourself leaving after like 5 minutes or maybe a lot longer. And you'd go, wait, I should not be here. How the hell did I get here? Because the forest just didn't want you there.
Yeah, it's fair to say that the elves of this time and the relationship with Athel Loren, because the elves have colonized pretty much all of the old world, and their relationship with Athel Loren was not a positive one. They lived on its periphery. They did not live within it, and they were afraid of it. And it's marked that they were afraid of it because when they changed their minds later in terms of where they're going to settle themselves, they have to make a choice as to where do they have more fear. And they choose that they are more afraid of, well, the issue that we're about to discuss than they are about the forest itself, and they sink into the forest. So, yeah, they do not have a particularly positive relationship with Athel Loren and the forest at this point at all.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is that the way the story is told, the dwarfs do not initially attack the elves that live by Athel Loren because there's not really a big strategic reason to. They're focused on the cities, attacking like oh god, what's the city they siege like 14 times? Toralessi. And so like there's all these different cities getting attacked all along what we now know as the Bretonnian coast and the Wasteland and the Empire. Like it's a mess, right? And the war gets bitter and awful. But eventually, Caldor II is slain, and the new Phoenix King, crap, I forget what the Phoenix King is after Caldor II.
I hate it when this happens, when you were just about to say it, and then someone asks you for it, and it just flees your mind.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Whatever. The Phoenix King after, I'm sure he'll remember in a second. But the Phoenix King after Caldor II calls all of the elves back to Ulthuan because Malekith is invading and they need everybody on board. Especially because a lot of Ulthuan's armies had gone.
Caradriel.
Thank you, Caradriel. Yep. So he calls everybody home and he even tells the colonists to come home. And some of the elves listen, but a lot of them don't. And this is when things start to get rough because the dwarfs, there's a problem. The High King, Gotrek Starbreaker, who was already sick of the war and he's lost a lot to the war, kills Caldor II and goes, all right, we're square. I'm going home. The war's over. The problem is not the High King doesn't get to tell all of the other kings what to do. And some of the kings say, fuck that. I'm still pissed. I'm not stopping till every single Elgi on this continent is dead. And so some of the kings continue attacking the elves aggressively. And this leads to some of the dwarves coming down towards the area of Athel Loren, and they begin hacking down the trees for fuel while also attacking any elves they can find, which there are elves around those forests.
That's not quite how it went, as I recall. It was a little bit more that the dwarves attacked the forest, and they really attacked the forest. Durthu almost dies. It's such an immense amount of axing their way through the forest in their attempt to basically grab all its resources and take it away, as dwarves are wont to do. And Durthu basically parts the forest and leads them through to the elves.
A better way to put it is that I think with the War of Vengeance, the elves are no longer able to protect the forest via diplomacy. by saying this forest is important. It's like you should not harvest this place, because it's weird that the dwarves would not have attacked it until now, which almost seems to imply to me that the elves had some measure of diplomatic protection for it.
There is something weird going on here, because it's a story that's simply dropped. And the story is loosely, the dwarves attacked the forest. The dwarves really attacked the forest. Durthu goes, eek, I'm almost dead. Durthu then parts the forest, lets the dwarves go in, and lets them pass out towards where the elves are. The elves go, what the heck? What's happened here? Think the dwarves are attacking, and they go to war. The elves and the dwarves have a big, huge, massive fight. The dwarves get sent on attacking.
Okay.
And then the dwarves come back again, and it eventually becomes the elves in a pitched battle with the dwarves. And they decide that the dwarves are much more of a threat than the forest. And they've also got the pact that was made long ago that gives them that sing-songy feel that they must move into the forest anyway. They move into the forest, and they become the first elves that settle properly inside the forest. And I think this is probably...
Okay, so I'm gonna mend my earlier statement.
Isn't this before the War of the Beard is properly going?
I'm pretty sure it's after, because there's a mention of the War of the Beard in the paragraph before, but
yeah,
I'm actually curious enough now that I want to look.
Yeah, so am I, because my memory is often faulty, so I'm quite happy to go check it up. So when did the War of the Beard come to an end again?
Yeah. So it's
I don't have my windows
here.
Let's see if I can open up one while I'm at it. Let's see if the chat can beat us to it. War of the Beard, give me your dates. I'm going to actually look it up.
This happens around...
So it ends until minus 1600. So yes, it's just after the War of the Beard is concluded.
Yeah, so this section is, minus 1500, so it's right after.
Yeah, it's right after. That's fascinating. Because
it talks about that it's after Caradriel calls all the elves back.
Yeah, totes. Okay, because that in and of itself is kind of fascinating, that the elves have decided to stay, ignore it, and they're not yet in Athel.
Yeah, that's that's super. Yeah, because it says the dwarves descend because the High Elves withdrew westward.
Yeah.
So the elves really were keeping the dwarves away from the forest somehow. That's super interesting. And
it's super interesting. It goes against lore elsewhere. There's definitely a story here.
There's I know if you read the War of Vengeance trilogy, like the actual Black Library books, it has it the other way, where the elves are called to the forest before the elves leave.
And
anyway, it doesn't matter.
Previous to the 8th edition book, it's the story I would almost certainly have said, which was that the elves were already deep inside Athel by this point. But the Wood Elf book, portrays it differently. It has approximately 100 years after the end of the actual War of Vengeance. The dwarves piled down into Athel. There are still elves sitting on the periphery of Athel somewhere, whether that's in the south or off towards its west. The dwarves strike through, do horrendous damage, and Durthu eventually, in a deeply wounded state, having had a massive argument with the two other elders, eventually allows them to pass through, and the elves become their best mates to protect them against the dwarves.
Yeah. Which the two interesting things, I'm not going to wax super lyrical on them in the interest of time, but it's fascinating to think that Durthu nearly died to the dwarves.
Yeah.
Which goes to show how fucking crazy strong this is before the earthquakes, but right after the War of Vengeance, granted, this is the dwarves at like the height of their aggression. Those dwarves are fucking scary.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the height of the elves and how scary they were also, because they were going toe-to-toe with each other.
Yeah.
And we're almost certainly dealing with some group of dwarves that have got the necessary runes to properly kick in a forest.
So if you're wondering why Durthu's face is all mangled, it's because of the dwarves. His face gets chopped up by an axe. Which is kind of funny to think about, because it almost implies he either picked up a dwarf or a dwarf like jumped on him and started like hacking at his face. But in any event, like Andy said, Durthu, this is really cool because this is actually a really classic Wood Elf strategy, but it goes to show that the forest spirits already had this strategy before the Wood Elves, which is allowing enemies to enter the forest and then dumping them on a different person, being like, you're going to deal with my problem for me.
Yeah, absolutely. The core tactics that will become the Wood Elf tactics are established by the spirits of the wood. And Durthu, as one of the primary commanders of said section, and probably I would argue that the good old trickster Treeman as well is going to be deeply behind much of the tactical nonce going on here. That we get the core of what will become the Wood Elf tactics very much established before the Wood Elves have even begun to exist. They are clearly going to be replicating the advice that they're going to be getting from the spirits of the wood, and everything that we come to know as Wood Elf characteristic, broadly speaking, are actually spiritual characteristics coming from their Wood Elf gods, for want of a better description. Although, as we will note in a little bit of time, the Wood Elves managed to get their own gods to step in.
Yeah, so at this point, Durthu's face has mostly been hacked off. The elves, they do defeat the dwarves because Durthu and Coadil, mostly Coadil, which is really interesting to think about.
It is interesting to think about.
Yeah, do a really clever trick of like every time the elves retreat into the forest, they use the forest pass to make the elves go much further than they should have, and the dwarves just can't catch them. So the dwarves are like, fuck it, we're going home. But being dwarfs, instead of being like, okay, we're Lund, they're like, no, we're gonna get a way bigger army and we're gonna come back and destroy everything.
And it's also worth noting that the dwarves were freaking canny. There was a reason that the spirits found it so difficult to hold off against them. That's that the dwarves were coming down late autumn into winter when all of the spirits were quiet. It also speaks to their awareness and knowledge of what it was like in Athel. They clearly knew what they were doing. They came down to clear out what they perceived to be an enemy. Now, if you want to put a different story on this, they could easily have just looked down and gone, that place is full of demons.
Yeah.
I mean, it would not surprise me if demon slaying,
especially
100% mincing their way through these Treeman spirits.
Yeah, especially
they basically are clearing the place out and making it, pacifying it, and a classic civilization takes out the wild.
Yeah, dwarves are like the least tolerant race when it comes to spirits, because to them they're all the same.
And so all the spirits are super slumberous because it's winter anyway. So they come through, and that's when we get the elves to step up because they don't have quite the same issues.
Yeah. So in the late autumn, because there's something coming in the winter, but in the late autumn, the dwarves come back, and the elves have fully retreated into Athel, which allows them in, and they're like, "Oh, this is really spooky, but it's not killing us," and they have nowhere else to go at this point. So they go deep into the forest, and they have a council, and this council comes to the decision that they're probably boned. Granted, one of the council members, Ariel, is having some interesting success at speaking with the trees, but the tree spirits have not revealed themselves yet. And what ends up happening is Ariel learns a little bit of some cool magic, but it's still not enough yet. And this builds up to Odinhu and Coadil get into a big argument because they know the dwarfs are coming. Yep. And Coadil says, this is the consequence of blooded life. We shouldn't trust any blooded life. We should kill them all. And Odinhu says, no, we have this pact. We should unify with the elves and fight as one. They have a responsibility to the forest. Let them fulfill that responsibility, but we have to talk to them. And Durthu says nothing. Durthu is so, he is now caught. Not only has he suffered tragedy in that he suffered greatly in the past, but he's also suffered horrific damage, and he's burning with hatred. And he knows that, which is why he keeps his mouth shut. He feels that he can't be impartial in this discussion. Odinhu eventually wins the debate. And Coadil is once again very upsetty spaghetti. And Odinhu goes to the elves. Not Durthu, Odinhu goes to the elves and says, hey, I exist. We're going to help you guys fight. And there's a huge battle between the dwarves and the elves with the assistance of the forest spirits. And this is the first time we see the elves and Durthu. Durthu actually does fight in this fight. Durthu fights side by side with the elves for the first time ever. And it's a horrible battle, but the dwarves are obliterated.
I wouldn't say that was the first time ever. He did it back in Avalorn.
Oh, okay. Sorry. The first time for Athel.
It feels like forever for him because it's been a long time since those battles back in the Cataclysm.
Yeah. And so the dwarves are defeated, but there is something on the wind, and it becomes very clear very fast because the dwarves, unfortunately, were not the biggest threat, which is spooky to think about. There was something that, because of the War of Vengeance, the dwarves did not have as strong of a grasp over the world. Neither did the elves. Something had grown in their absence, and it was a war. So a greenskin invasion comes north that is fucking huge. Like one of the biggest wars that has been seen in ages, because the dwarves and the elves aren't around anymore. In the numbers they used to be. And they start beelining for Athel Loren, likely because they knew there was a big dwarf army there and were probably following them, being greenskins. And the elves come to realize, oh crap, we're all going to die. Because the forest spirits, like Andy said, they get slow in the winter. They go to sleep. And a lot of them go to sleep, despite the fact of the orc threat. They can't help it. It's their nature. Some of them, like Adenhu and Durthu, can remain awake, but most forest spirits have to slumber. And even if they did fight, they're so slow and sluggish that they're not even that helpful.
Yeah, I particularly like this section because you begin to understand the loose demographics of how it all fell out. Now, that's not necessarily the most fascinating way of examining how this all unfolds, but the loss of the elves and the dwarves colonizing the old world allowed a power vacuum that the greenskins moved into. And that power vacuum was something that the elves and the dwarves, great allies as they were, and also it's worth noting, a whole bunch of other little human tribes that are probably kicking around in the periphery. All of these are keeping things like the greenskins very much down. And the Great War of Vengeance effectively spells the downfall of the dwarfs, because the rise of the greenskins into all these empty areas where once there have been elves populating that area eventually is what's going to bring them to their knees. And the elves are also suffering an immediate response to everything that went wrong. The very fact that they stayed here instead of hiking it back home has put them in extraordinary danger.
Yep. And this is known as the Winter of Woe.
Winter of Woe.
There's a lot we could talk about, but in the interest of time, we're kind of going to skip over a lot of
this.
this.
Look at it. Look at the time already. We've been 2 hours in.
So all we're going to say is that Ariel and Orion are created as the Lady so the Queen and the King in the Wood are chosen and emerge for the first time. And this invigorates the forest and allows the elves to defeat the orcs. And it's awesome. Great.
I'll add just a little extra bit there just to make sure that we are fully aware of what has just happened. 2 elven gods manifest as avatars within elves to effectively protect everything and significantly change and reinforce the nature of Athel Loren. This is going to be, this isn't just massive, it's freaking huge.
It's foundational.
It's foundational to what will become Athel Loren and the Wood Elf realm that will be there. And it's foundational also to Durthu's character, because this is where everything changes. He's no longer the sole, one of the sole responsible, let's say, powers in the forest. He is one of now 5? 3 great. He said a +2 gods, plus arguably more, because we also have creatures like Death that we could potentially discuss. There are quite.
And Loek has a huge relationship with Athel Loren.
Indeed. It's fair to say that multiple elven gods are going to make direct impact into the Wood Elf realm, and that puts Durthu in a different place. It both allows him to fade away to a degree, and allow others to step up and take in those places, which probably isn't the best for his psychology. Let's be honest, he's not in the best place anyway. I mean, he's just not in a good place. But it also means that he's got potential allies now. But as we will find out, Durthu doesn't really come out of all of this in a particularly good place.
So this is like Andy said, a big moment, because this is when you get the stamp of finality on the bond between Athel Loren and the Wood Elves. They become like, they're inseparable. They are the same.
And again, to make sure it's super clear, this is what Durthu set up. Durthu did this. Durthu made the Wood Elves. Durthu establishes all of this back during the Cataclysm with the deal that he makes with the Everqueen. Remember, this isn't necessarily just Wood Elves. This is elves. He made a deal with the elves, and these elves have now come in, and they have become something different. And it's worth noting, you could argue that the deal that he made perhaps wasn't just with the Everqueen.
It was with...
The deal was potentially with Isha. The deal was potentially with what the elves represent.
She came with that deal, along with gods very close to her.
And they manifest inside the forest because they come with the elves, because the elven gods are inseparable from their children, shall we say. Saying I've brought some elves in isn't exactly what you might first think. You might think, oh, we've got a bunch of magical elves. Yay, we've got ourselves a bunch of Teclis and Tyrion alikes to come and protect us. No, they also bring their gods, and some of them manifest directly because these elves are in absolute danger from what's about to happen to them. This, arguably, was what Durthu was dealing for.
Yep. So, from this point on, Durthu takes on... Durthu's not the same as he used to be. He's no longer the gregarious, kind-hearted thing, but he's still present. He's not what he's about to become. Like, he still talks with elves. He still teaches them. They're teaching them how to tree sing and all this stuff.
It's all coming back.
Yeah. And Durthu participates in a couple of major battles, fighting alongside the elves. And he even gets, at some point, we don't know exactly when, but at some point, Daith, who is, spoilers, Vol incarnate, just like Ariel is Aisha and Orion is Kurnos.
Yeah.
Daith forges him a sword. And this sword is fucking huge. And the Sword of Daith is a beautiful, giant, big, badass weapon that is designed to make Durthu an even more effective warrior than he already was. Because think about what he is, right? This is a borderline god wielding a weapon forged for him by a god of Smith.
Borderline god.
Yeah, which is
totally
bonkers. Like, if he wasn't already stupid strong before, he is now. And things continue okay until one particularly really bad set of tragedies.
Here it comes.
And the really sad thing is that whether she'd ever admit it or not, they're kind of all Ariel's fault. The first thing that happens is that one day Ariel senses something coming into existence. Whether it's not, probably not for the first time, but she senses him because he did something to a forest.
Let's stop there because we've got quite a few super chats.
Yeah.
Let's run through those and get those before we go into what is going to be poor old Durthu's endgame.
Yep.
Because poor old Durthu. I love Durthu, such a great character, but yeah, it's not going to go well for him.
Here we go. If you did a Morcott stream, this drinking game we've all been playing with got very dangerous. Late again, guys. Hope I didn't miss anything. You
missed quite a lot.
Yes, but you can always go back.
I would definitely suggest go back and watch the video on demand later because we covered quite a lot of really cool stuff back during the Cataclysm.
Yep, Michael Kirkplay is one of the main, if not the writer for the Elder Scrolls world.
There you go. I've had an interview before with Lawrence Schnecht, who you may know because he was the lore lead on Elder Scrolls. You can find that over on Rookery Publications.
Hey, go watch that.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. He's also the chap who did Baldur's Gate 3. He was the primary lore writer for that. So yes, super cool guy. He lives over in Ireland.
Commander Bone. Also, honestly, Athel would have been in danger even if the elves hadn't been there. The Azrael probably alleviated any future bad events from happening. Well, that's kind of the ultimate catch-22 is that Athel would have always been in danger. But what we're going to get into is that the problem is that Durthu perceives the danger that does happen as his fault, which makes it personal, whereas it would have not been otherwise. You missed Andy promised 5 minutes. Nope. Kirkland, the old Elder Scrolls writers. He did some of the more insane shit, such as the 27 Lessons of Vivek. Also wrote Lusty Argonian Maid. My personal hero.
Lusty Argonian Maid.
my hero. Let's see. Did the War of the Bears make the tree spirits and Wood Elves feel bitter towards the other elves? It certainly didn't help. And forest spirits it plays a role.
Okay, so if you take a look at that in its face value, if you bring the comment back up there.
Yeah.
So did the War of the Beard make the tree spirits and wood elves feel bitter towards other elves? Now, at the moment, there are no wood elves during the War of the Beard. So the first answer is no. They don't exist as other elves. Okay, do the tree spirits have any particular hatred towards the other elves? They hate everybody anyway. So the whole xenophobia that the wood elves will come, that comes from the tree spirits that live there already. They already hate them. So does it make them bitter towards the other elves? No, not any more than they already are. So I'd say, if anything, no, it didn't change a single thing.
Yeah, that's fair. Michael Kirkblade was the illustrator as well.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Was he?
Interesting. Illustrator and originator of the deeper and nuttier lore of Elder Scrolls, he also wrote Darth Vader starting the rebellion in pre-Disney Star Wars. Okay, the Drake. I saw some people asking about Drake guns. Drake guns did not exist yet, according to the lore we have. That may change, but Drake guns are a relatively recent-ish, so like last few centuries invention, as opposed to this would have been like 4,000 years ago. Tibal, would a dwarf slayer be a demon slayer because of big enough tree spirit? Probably, from a dwarf perspective, yeah.
Yeah, particularly if it's a spirit that is a threat to the dwarves and threat to the Karakankor. That being the case, then yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a big, massive, effectively, as far as they're concerned, demon. What's the difference between that and, say, a giant dragon that's threatening them all? Nothing really, except it's the big wood spirity thing. Yeah, I definitely think that they have slain something of particular puissance.
Yeah, and they probably wouldn't be like, oh, you're a tree slayer. They'd probably use a more cool sounding name. Necromancer Cobalt, you guys are awesome. Quick question: how did Durthu's character change over the editions? He just became much more important. Is the real thing to say?
Initially, it was just a few lines playing Big Ancient Treeman. Away we go, and then he became the epitome of the Big Ancient Treeman, effectively almost becoming a god.
He became like kind of the creator of the Wood Elves, to be frank.
Yep, he did.
Zarn4, thank you very much. Ryan Wood, I may have missed this. What happened to Durthu's face? Dwarfs. Dwarfs chopped him up.
Yep.
Jonathan Scott, why do the forest spirits even have genders? They're not really genders in the sense that humans would understand. This is a really bitch of a one.
This is a really tough one. And I think that both of us are going to struggle to answer this in a way that we're happy with. But they do express gender, and they often express it's one of the reasons why I would strongly suggest that the Everqueen had a relationship with Durthu. Durthu has chosen to be male aspected. They are shapeshifters. They are not strictly speaking male and female in terms of their sex. They are spirits. And a lot of the way that they work is reflected in their chosen gender to appear as. For example, the playful nature of the dryads. They play almost a role to entice and pull in, and that is typically feminine. So many of the dryads have a very feminine aspect. The same for the naiads and the spirits of the water. They're all about enticing people down and characteristics that are generally perceived to be feminine. But when they turn into their war aspect, all concepts of what appears to be gender in terms of male and female have, if anything, turned entirely male. Something that looks and in many respects feels like it's for war. So the gender is nothing more than an expression of what they represent, because don't think of them, strictly speaking, as normal entities. These things are somewhat spiritual, demonic in essence. That being the case, they're a little bit more conceptual. They're a bit more about emotions, a little bit more about what they represent. And in this case, they're shape-shifting spirits of the wood, many of which are mischievous, many of which are angry, many of which are filled with fury, which will be represented with various genders according to the appropriateness of the situation that they're in.
Yeah, and I would say that this is kind of one of those situations it's don't get the lore mixed up with the constraints of a tabletop design game, where they go, oh, well, we want you to understand that the dryads are kind of feminine, so we're going to give them tree boobs, even though a lot of them probably wouldn't in their war aspects.
Yeah, totally. Because I agree, they do have tree boobs. I have painted those tree boobs more times than I can.
Trycha's got a big set of knockers, probably wouldn't really bother with that in her war aspect a lot of the time. But it's a really whole thing, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to let you sit with Andy's answer, and we'll talk about it another day.
And I think that's a good place for us to end. They are shapeshifters.
Yeah. So continuing on with Durthu, two big things are about to happen. The first is Morgur. Morgur, no matter what anybody tells you, Morgur is the antithesis of Athel Loren. He is the big bad, period. And Morgur is somewhere in the world, and he does something, likely hurting some part of the world roots, because Ariel notices him to the extent that it literally says that Ariel's just minding her business in the King's Glade one day, and then suddenly she cries out and a tear falls down her face because Morgur has done something in the world. We don't know what, but he did something. He either ate a god, maybe one of the elven gods, or he destroyed a world root. He did something. Morgur has eaten multiple gods. That is one of his things, is he's a god eater, which is fucking terrifying. And Ariel fucks up really bad right here, because Ariel does something stupid. She does it for a good reason, but it's stupid, which is that she goes through the world routes by herself to track down Morgur. She finds him and she obliterates him and all these other beastmen he's hanging out with. There's some actually super fucking cool artwork of this moment where she's like raining down like white fire on all of Morgur's buddies.
Totally.
And she looks around and goes, I did good. And she leaves. Here's the problem. She didn't kill him. Because Morgur is insanely fucking hard to kill, especially with magic. It just doesn't work on him, to be frank. And Morgur, she didn't know this. She doesn't know what Morgur's capable of. So she thinks she kills him, and she doesn't. And he heals because he regenerates like a motherfucker. He gets up, and he goes, that smells tasty. And he follows her. And that's the biggest fuck up in the whole story, is that he gets Ariel's scent and he starts making his way towards Athel Loren. Yeah. And he will do this for the rest of time. Yep. He's got her scent. He wants to eat that god goodness, and he follows her for the rest of until the world blows up. And that is horrible. Like, this is the biggest mistake Ariel ever makes, in my opinion.
I don't think that's unfair. I mean, particularly given what the Beastmen end up doing to the world routes, where they're constantly attacking into, getting into, and destroying parts of the world routes, and using the magical power that lies in there to further increase their capabilities. This is arguably one of the events that leads to the end times. Yeah.
So Morgur attacks Athel Loren. The first big war is ugly. Morgur is kind of unstoppable for a good while because the Wood Elves have never fought him before and they don't really know how to deal with him. And it builds up to this really, really big battle at what will become known as the Glade of Woe. At this time, it's known as a Diavok.
Whoa!
Drycha's personal grove. Mm-hmm. And there's this huge epic battle between Morgur and the Wood Elves, and this war has been raging for a while, where Morgur's just been unstoppable. Because the problem with Morgur is, like how we talked earlier, where like the forest spirits can kind of go crazy when they fight demons. Morgur dials that up to 11, to where sometimes when the Wood Elves were fighting alongside the forest spirits against Morgur, the forest spirits would just go insane and start attacking the Wood Elves. So the Wood Elves couldn't even trust their allies because the forest spirits would go, they were that horribly influenced by Morgur's presence. And Ariel had essentially invited that to them.
Yep.
Which is awful. And so this big war breaks out. And what happens, the most horrible critical moment, which will pay off later, is that Coadil sacrifices himself. And I don't think a lot of people give Coadil the credit he deserves for this moment because of what happens later. But Coadil runs into battle because Morgur's unstoppable. And he picks up Morgur and is trying to crush him in his hands. And he can't, because that's how scary Morgur is. There is a borderline god squeezing him, and Morgur is still not dead yet. And Ariel uses this moment to just bombard Morgur with magic. And between that and Coadil crushing, he dies. And he basically pops. And the problem is that his blood gets all over Coadil, all over the Glade of Woe, or a Diavok. And the Wood Elves learn in this moment that Morgur's blood is a permanent corruption.
Yeah.
So the Glade, a Diavok, which was once beautiful, becomes known as the Glade of Woe, where nothing wholesome will ever grow again, which causes Drycha to go fucking insane. And Coadil, they think is fine. He says he's fine, but he's not. He basically just gained like 600 corruption points, and he failed his mental mutation roll.
Yep.
And Coadil, although nobody realizes it, that spiteful nature of his starts to warp into something much, much uglier. And the most horrible, sinister part is that nobody realizes. Auden, who doesn't know it, Durthu doesn't know it. They don't realize that Coadil at this point forward is changed. And this leads to, once again, I want to focus mostly on Durthu, so I'm going to kind of fast forward. This leads to Coadil attacking the Wild Riders when they're trying to get the next Orion. And he tries to murder all of them because he knows if he kills all the Wild Riders, Orion's dead forever.
Just to make sure that we're clear that every year Orion is rebirthed and comes slamming out, and Coadil attempts to interrupt the cycle.
Yeah, because Codale's not doing this because he's like, ha ha ha, I'm evil. Codale's madness has come to the point where he's convinced that the forest is being held back. It's being limited by the elves, which, to be fair, by this point, the elves did install all the waystones around Athel to contain it, but that's to protect it, not to harm it, because the wood elves become aware that if the Athel is just allowed to grow as much of it once, it's going to become too aggressive and it's going to invite more danger as it just expands. It's better to keep it limited and healthy, which if you've ever grown plants in your garden or tended trees and stuff, you know that's something very legitimate you have to do with plants. You have to control their growth oftentimes to keep them safe. And so Coadil tries to kill all the Wild Riders. Ariel manages to wake up in time and she defeats him, but she can't kill him because to kill him would basically be killing part of Athel Loren. It would be like the ultimate violation. So she banishes him to the Wildwood where he becomes contained. So for Durthu, one of his only 2 remaining brothers in existence has sacrificed himself, got corrupted, and became so insane that he almost basically sabotaged the entirety of Athel Loren.
And is now imprisoned.
Yeah, and Durthu can do nothing.
Nothing about it. So, hey, nice to see. Nice one, Codil.
Yeah. So another big tragedy there. Then this boils up to the next really big event, which is that we fast forward a while. Durthu does some cool epic fights. He's becoming more violent. And at this point, Durthu is spending a lot of time alone thinking, which is not great for him. If you've ever been depressed, you know that's not really a good way to deal with it. You should, talk to people, preferably a therapist, not just dwell on it. But Durthu is dwelling. And Ariel goes through a really bad set of circumstances, which is that her sister is murdered by the shenanigans of Morathi, which was Malekith's wife, fun fact. So Alisara is killed, and Ariel gets extremely upset and goes all out on trying to find who killed her sister. And she starts delving into dark magic. And by using the power of dark magic, she manages to break Morathi's shrouds, finds where Morathi is, and goes over there with a bunch of Treeman.
off to Nagaroth.
They go through the world routes, and they attack Grond, which they actually win. Like, Morathi loses that battle against Orion, Ariel, probably Durthu as well. Like, they just obliterate the walls of Grond, go in there, but Ariel spares Morathi in exchange for the secrets of dark magic to master it.
And I think it's also worth noting here, just so that we get it, there's a general belief that Dark Elf society doesn't work. That it's just it's almost a comical version of what society could be. But as it says multiple times in the good old army list, Dark Elves are master. Now, they're not the master manipulators that you might get from, say, the High Elves, but they are the super smooth talkers. They are used to turning enemies to their side. And this isn't just Morathi because she's some extraordinary visage of elven marvelousness.
I mean, she is.
But she is. But this is what Dark Elves do. They're constantly used to making deals with their enemies, or those that they perceive to be their enemies. Because normally, just a century back, they attempted to kill each other. They're very used to talking each other around. They are, of all the elves, the smoothest talkers. And this is something that's often forgotten about them. And it is here expressed beautifully, because Morathi convinces the good old Queen of the Wood to back down over the death of her sister.
Yeah, with Orion saying, no, we need to kill this bitch. Like, Orion was ready to do it. And Morathi talks her way out of it to a god, which is very impressive. So this builds up to Ariel becomes more and more obsessed with dark magic, and it begins to corrupt her because she's not taking the necessary precautions. And one thing Morathi very cleverly did not tell her were those precautions, because Morathi knows how to use dark magic, quote unquote, responsibly. Ariel was not. She was using it to gain power, which comes with a gross cost if you're not careful. And the problem is, as Ariel becomes corrupted, the forest becomes corrupted.
Yep.
And Durthu and them start to be like, something weird's going on here. But they're like, okay, whatever. And then Ariel, again, with Morgar, does something really fucking stupid, which is that Ariel becomes convinced that she could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. She could gain the power she needs to protect Athel Loren and do as she pleases and kill Morgur simultaneously. How can she do this? By devouring Morgur.
It's worth noting by this point, she realizes that Morgur is immortal, effectively, will be reborn after each time he's killed. And that's a detail that clearly she didn't know to begin with. It's why she made her first mistake. Morgur just don't die. So she has now come up with a plan to resolve this immortality. And she's going to resolve this immortality by what? Chowing down.
Pulling a Morgur on Morgur.
Which I kind of love as a crazy
Use my
plan.
spells against me, Potter! Ariel, to her credit, is horrifically powerful at this point. Because dark magic is fucking strong. She tracks down Morgur.
She's the god.
Yeah. She tracks down Morgur. She beats the shit out of him and captures him. And then, so remember everything we said about the world roots earlier? About why you don't take things through it? Don't take blooded life, yada, yada, yada. Ariel drags fucking Morgur back through the world roots.
Yep.
What the fuck? Like, I love this part of the story because A, it shows how far gone she is, and B, just shows how horrific of a betrayal this is. Because Durthu senses it and goes, whoa, no. So Durthu rampages his way to the Glade of Kings, where Ariel's performing a ritual to devour Morgur, which, remember, means she's going to take everything that Morgur is, good and bad, into herself and into the forest. And Durthu shows up with his big old sword and goes, nope, splat. And he kills Morgur right in front of her. And Ariel rages at him.
She is not happy one bit.
Yeah. She can't, she doesn't attack him, but she screams at him and rages at him. And Durthu says nothing. He doesn't look at her. He doesn't talk to her. He kills Morgur and then he just walks away.
And you can clearly see that there is a moment where Ariel's thinking, I could kill him for this, but doesn't, because he's an elder. He pretty much created everything that they are in the first place. And I would like to think that perhaps the influence of Visha stilled her hand. But I think if it had been Ariel alone, very possibly she would have taken that step.
I agree.
Yeah.
And then we get the final big tragedy, which is that at the end of Ariel's little saga with dark magic, there is finally a moment where Ariel goes too far. Like, she has stopped resurrecting Orion. Like, she's not performing the ritual anymore. She's ruling alone. And the dark magic is starting to influence the forest to such an extent that dryads are starting to lose it. And the forest itself is becoming corrupt from dark magic. It's starting to reflect Ariel's rage and desire for power and aggression. And this leads to essentially a civil war between those that are not corrupt and those that are still loyal to Ariel. And Odinhu leads the charge, not Durthu, because Durthu is more focused on violence as a solution, where Odinhu sees another way. And Odinhu fights his way to Ariel, and he touches her, and he absorbs all of it. He absorbs all the corruption, all the he takes all of the corruption that she's been holding on to into himself. And it is so much because, remember, Ariel's bound to the forest, so anything she's going through, the forest is going through. So he didn't just absorb Ariel's corruption, he absorbs Athel Loren's corruption, and it kills him instantly.
Dead.
So
that I think it's also worth adding here that the word corruption is strongly used here because generally the concept of dark magic is closely related through to chaos and its influence, yet somehow the dark elves manifest and control this. If we want to take a more elven view of what's going on here, you could argue that this is the first steps for the entirety of Athel Loren turning from what it was into effectively a more dark elf version of where it was going. The civil war that was building, everything that was about to occur would have turned all of Athel Loren into potentially the equivalent of another, which is horrendous to think of, but another Nagaroth with a very different tone, with all sorts of corrupted, incredibly angry, broken, furious spirits. And that's something that one of the elders, Gudalharn, decides that that's an unacceptable future for Athel. So he steps in and takes that option away and just completely eradicates it at the cost of his own life. It is not necessarily, if you are trying to be objective and moving yourself beyond the morals of good and evil, a worse or better outcome. Because in the end of the world comes anyway.
Yeah.
It's going to come anyway. And the influence that Athel has on it is almost negligible in comparison to the greater scheme of things. Could they have done more if they had been more darkly aspected, if you wish to use such language? Possibly, possibly not. But I definitely think that this is a choice that the elders are making about what they feel the future of Athel should be. And if you're looking for what's the bigger tale here, this is one of the elders. This is the elder that can see the future. This is the elder that is looking to enact, if we want to go right back to basic premise of who they are, enact the old one's plan, enact what they are there to do. And the seer chose to keep Athel this way. So again, you could take an argument, much as we did in our old ones, not the old ones, probably the old world streams, that this very much is the old one's plans being made manifest. And this is the Treeman stepping in and killing himself to ensure that that particular plan comes to pass, because that's the sort of visions that are plaguing him. He is, after all, a seer, and the very nature of his existence was planted all the way back by, I don't know, Kremlo.
Yeah, it's
he was going around seeding them all in.
Yeah, if you care about AOS lore, this is also a critical fucking moment for what the Sylvaneth will become, because they would not have happened if this path had not been taken. So Adenhu dies, which means Durthu is now alone.
Yeah, that's it.
It is him and one other elder who is Coladil, who has been infused with the blood of Morgur and is completely batshit crazy. And Durthu is completely, brutally alone. From this moment on, he participates in a couple fights, but this is now the Durthu the Durthu in like Total War, Tree Hitler, as some people like to call him, because his AI is very aggressive. His AI is so aggressive in like back in Warhammer 1. He would like wipe the map. He was terrifying.
He wasn't that bad. I played quite a bit of Warhammer 1.
So many people hated him back then because he was just so mean. Anyway,
he was.
Yeah. So Durthu at this point is it's super funny. So Durthu at this point is a character who the lore goes deep into say that he does not hate elves.
No.
But he deeply, because of his perspective, he deeply, deeply regrets the pact that he forged. Because from his perspective, the elves have invited constant danger into Athel. They're the ones that brought Morgur. They're the ones that debatably brought, from his perspective, brought the dwarfs. They bring so many threats to the forest and cause the forest to expend resources. And so many of his fellow Treeman, his fellow ancients, his fellow elders are now dead because of wars the elves started.
Yeah. Durthu, in many respects, will massively influence the Wood Elves by literally doing nothing. Everything that the Wood Elves represent, the Azrai, their isolationist views, their hatred of all outsiders, everything that they are, Durthu is manifesting within the wood right at the very heart of it, wandering around hating everything, full of regret over everything he's done. He's basically one gigantic, depressed, angry, rage-filled tree. He is alone. His lost love is gone. His everything he was living for is now corrupted to its core, while simultaneously hanging on by a thread. And his only hope, his friends are all gone, they're all dead, and what's left to live for? So he just stomps around in the wood by himself in a similar way to many of the elves, wandering around the wood, protecting it, but hating everything that lies on the outside. The elves reflect the wood reflects the elves, and Durthu is almost the ultimate expression of the wood elf and isolationist views. He has taken on all of that mantle, and it has completely flooded down into everything around him in the same way that it in turn is flooding back up to him. he is now the king of the wood in a way that the king of the wood, Orion, simply isn't. He represents the wood in a way that Orion simply doesn't, because he's the god of the wood, not the god of the elves. And it very much shows. All of the spirits, many ways, reflect his views. And yes, we still have our trickster tree sitting out there completely corrupted. And you could argue that much of the playfulness of some of the spirits still manifests through that, because we have ourselves two gods of the wood, if you will, still alive. But that one's lost. It's gone and is separated from the rest of the wood. He's broken, man. Poor old broken tree man. It's the worst. Sorry, Durthu.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, Durthu is incredibly powerful magically because he's one of the 2 elders left.
Level 1.
Yeah, but one of the things they did that I like is that they talk about that Durthu doesn't manifest his magic because he's so wound up in his depression and his rage that he's not really able to tap into it. But one of the things that it manifests as is he creates, without meaning to, spirits called Lamentations of Despair. And these spirits, when he's in battle, will literally pour out of him and lash out and rip people apart around him, which is fucking terrifying. But the really fucked up thing about the Lamentation of Despairs is what they actually do, which is when Durthu slumbers. When Durthu sleeps, these despairs that he creates from magic just roiling off of him. So think about that. He is so magically powerful that spirits are being created from his dreams and his outlashes of emotions. His Lamentations of Despairs, which you may be aware are a really cool ability in Total War, but what they do that's really depressing is that when he sleeps, they keep getting created and they whisper in his ears. And all they're reflections of how he feels. So all they do is tell him the things that he's thinking. So they're telling him, this is your fault. You're alone.
Being spiritual, they kind of sing it to him, so it's not.
So they're singing
these horrible wraith-like entities swirling around him, and at least they're singing.
Yeah, so if you were to find Durthu like in the winter, like you just happened to pass by his grove, you would literally hear a song of spirits, if you understood their tongue, whispering to him all of his greatest fears and nightmares. That it's his fault, he's alone. None of this would have happened if it hadn't been for him. If he had left Avalorn sooner, if he hadn't agreed to help Astariel, maybe if he had never loved her, maybe he could have saved her if he had stayed. Just everything that haunts him, literally haunts him.
Yep.
And the most horrible thing is he's the only one that can stop it. If he could pull himself out of it, he has the magic to restore a lot of things and to do a lot of really powerful things. But he's so deep in his depression, he just can't see his own way out of it.
So true.
Which, like, holy fuck, is that relatable and depressing?
Yeah, I love Durthu. I think he's a great character. And I think he's a great character because he is fundamentally broken. That beyond all of that as well, he still has that kernel of hope lying within him, almost as if there's the possibility that Athel, Loren, and the entire world itself can be returned to its great splendor, that can become something that it has lost. So you've got almost that seed of potential lying within him. And if you, again, this is an example of where, as we reach the end of Durthu's tale, I feel that the end times really did not really do what it needed to. This is a character that had such an extraordinary story that should have impacted the end times in a greater fashion, and not more than just that such and such goes to war, such and such faces this character. Ultimately, Durthu should almost certainly have died, and the seeds from his body being used to recreate something new and beautiful.
So they did do that in Age of Sigmar, which retconned end time stuff. So
I missed that. Okay, because I don't keep up with the Age of Sigmar. Yeah. I wouldn't mind this little extra tale at the end. I'm going to give
you all the TLDR for time reasons because we still have to answer questions. So yes, what happens to Durthu in the end times? He gets 2 really awesome moments, which is that first he participates in the final war on Ulthuan, where he goes toe to toe with Tyrion wielding the Widowmaker, and to show how badass Durthu is, when Tyrion tries to stab him, he just grabs the Widowmaker, like he grabs the Sword of Cain, picks it up, and throws Tyrion like a fucking frisbee way out of the forest. Now, it fucks up Durthu's hand really bad, but luckily Alariel's there to heal him. But that goes to show how incredibly strong Durthu is. He takes a hit from the Widowmaker. Damn.
Yeah. Damn.
So after that, after he chucks Tyrion like a sack of coins, which is one of my favorite moments in the end times because it's so goofy. Like it's a realistic way to deal with him. It's just funny. But after that, we don't see really Durthu again until a big fight in Athel, where Coadil teams up with Drycha, Be'lakor, and Helibron, which is an interesting party.
As you do.
Yeah, and there's a big fight, but we get the kaiju battle between Coadil and Durthu, which interestingly, Coadil wins initially. Like, because of his corruption or whatever you want to say it, or Durthu not being able to put everything into killing his own brother, Coadil rips off Durthu's arm and is about to kill when Alariel intervenes, now as the Incarnate of Life, and she uses a big spell that causes Durthu's arm to heal and rip back out of his body as a new arm, and he's able to finally kill Coadil and beat him down and stab him and kill him, which is horrible for Durthu. It is legitimately horrible. He has to murder his own brother who couldn't help it. Like it wasn't his fault. And because of that, Durthu becomes the last elder. He gets a huge power boost because now the power, instead of being split evenly, is all in him. He temporarily kind of heals from his madness at last and becomes hilariously overpowered. But what he does that plays into AOS is that Alariel's power is weakening because the world is ending. So the Incarnate of Life is losing a lot of power. Durthu pulls an Odinhu. He basically he pours everything that he is into her, and he dies, but she becomes infused with everything he was, which makes her go Super Saiyan. And she is her big bad awesome form until the end. So in AOS, what they do that I love is that when Alariel is resurrected comes back as the goddess of life, one of the things that she does is that we find out that the Haven actually did work to an extent, which was the plan of Lilith. And Alariel also, when she died, when she returned, she has some soul pods with her. One of them is Durthu's. But she can't just resurrect Durthu. Instead, what she does is she uses her magic, remembering Durthu's sacrifice, to basically emulate him, where she uses the life magic that exists within AOS to create a series of seeds that are all replica. They're known as the Sons of Durthu. So they look like Durthu, which is why you can still use the mini. And she plants these all over the place. But what this ties into is that the Sons of Durthu are basically the bodyguard of the goddess of life. And they do not know Durthu, but she tells stories of Durthu to them in the Sylvaneth as stories to emulate, parables. And what we end up getting in one of the more recent stories in AOS that I love very much was the resurrection of the Oak of Ages. Because the Oak of Ages, when the AOS world blew up, it physically blew up as well as every other way. And the Oak of Ages was shattered and went flying off into space. And it eventually crash lands in the realm of life, because it explains that the way the realms form is they coalesced from all of that particular wind. So the Oak of Ages, being a big old thing of Gyram, was drawn to the realm of life eventually, and it crash lands in a part of it. And at the end of 2nd edition AOS, Alariel performs this huge fucking ritual called the Rite of Life, and she resurrects the Oak of Ages. And it puts new roots down into the soil, and a new Athel Loren is born. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that in the modern setting.
That's that's the old one's plan being made manifest since they
it's all according to plan.
All going according to plan. There we
but
go.
The Sons of Durthu have some really cool short stories in AOS. They're tragic. Like, they're very sad. Unfortunately, the Sons of Durthu seem cursed to emulate their father.
Bummer.
But I love the idea that Alariel and Ariel, who are kind of the same person now, have such deep, fond memories of what Durthu was, that they created essentially not copies, but descendants to follow in his footsteps as a guardian. They're not as powerful as... Yeah.
I am Durthu. I am Durthu.
But but there are some really fun, sad short stories that if you want, you can hit me up on Discord and I can send you some recommendations. But it's one of my more favorite parts of AOS. There's also the funny part where Alariel finally, in desperation, replants Drycha's soul pod. Drycha, she comes back strong, But to say that she's still batshit nasty is understatement.
I'm not entirely sure that was wise. So as we bring all of this to a close, what do we have? We have got ourselves the last really living remnant of an old world plan that was first seeded in Athel, Loren, all the way back before the Cataclysm. A forest that somehow managed to gain sentience and spirits that started popping up all over the place. When the Cataclysm eventually arrived, Durthu was over with the High Elves and had been living with them for some time and was perhaps the lover of the Everqueen. The events that then transpired left Durthu a somewhat broken Treeman over in Athel Loren, having made a deal with the elves to have them eventually protect Athel Loren, potentially even in his stead, given that he, come the fullness of time, will be just left in the middle, a broken, absolutely despair-filled creature who looks at his great forest where he was once born many millennia earlier as a fractured, war-torn, corrupted version of what it potentially could be, and he entirely blames himself for all of it. He is, of all the characters of the Warhammer world, one of the saddest, and also one of, and we do say this a lot, but he is one of the most powerful. He is quite literally a god. He is beyond what the vast majority of other characters can be. He is one of the few characters that can go toe-to-toe with almost anyone. You could see him going toe-to-toe with Nagash, with him going toe-to-toe with a giant freaking dragon. He is the sort of character that can do almost anything the individual writer wants him to do, because he has the power of all of Athel Loren and arguably all of the spirits of Athel Loren and the forests around the world channeling up through him. Now, admittedly, half of that power is also shared by, let's say, his corrupt brother, which I think also makes for a super interesting tale. So, what sort of questions do we have? Before we do that, do we want to jump into our super chat? Unless you've got anything you want to conclude with?
Yep, that Durthu is officially / unofficially the god of depression.
There we go. Nice.
Poor Durthu. Okay, here we go. Greetings from Jack Flanagan. Well, greetings.
Hey, Jack. Delighted for you to drop by.
He rolled an 8 on his super chat. Morger is evil Beastman Kenny. God damn it. Kodo got ill.
Yeah. Ill? Oh, seriously? Man.
Is Ariel's corruption why Alariel and AOS is meaner? No. Alariel and AOS, you have to remember that she fused with Ariel. And so she's a more accurate representation of a nature goddess, which is going to come with the spooky side of nature. Yeah, nature, quite literally, and I know this may sound obvious, but a force of nature, which is by its very nature, to say nature too many times, somewhat unpredictable. The old act of God line, things that will not necessarily go well for the good old warm-blooded mortals. Yeah, and current Alariel in AOS is also in her war aspect, so she's going to be a little meaner as well, because she's in an aggressive aspect. Strix, I tossed my coin to the Witcher's
Thank you, Strix.
Tale said, yep. Inquisitor Thomas, in Warhammer World, the Ardens, Blitzkrieg, Germany. Durthu. Patrick Mulligan, my birthday's coming up April 3rd. Please get Andy Law, Leask, Hall, and Chambers in his stream this year. I don't know if we can handle that many Andys in one Council of Andys. Sotek 2. Oh, I'm glad that I'm an afterthought to be included. Why does Usain Bolt worship Ariel? The guy ran. Oh man. That almost made me laugh. Did Durthu ever interact with Orion's Wild Hunt? Yeah, he participates more because like the whole forest is roused to a battle. It's hard to resist Orion's hunt. I'm sure there are times that Durthu does resist it, but most of the time he probably just goes along. Depending on what he's up to. All right, so questions. Let's plow through these really, really fast. All right. Do you think Durthu has ever unironically yelled, "Get off my damn lawn" in his entire existence? He's probably said something to the similar effect, but I doubt he used that verbiage. I think that's fair. Do other tree spirits call him Grandpa? No, but they probably do have special terms that a writer has not figured out yet to refer to him. Absolutely. What does Durthu consider to be the root of Athel Loren's problems? Pun aside, in his current state, he genuinely considers it to be himself, if not the elves. Him. And I think for his story, let's turn it inward. It's him. He believes that he is
both the doom and the savior of it. And that's why he is brooding so long, because what else could he have done? How could he have done things differently? Yeah, he's the problem.
How does Durthu view other non-woodland spirits? Does he view a place like Kislev being a similar situation to Athel Loren? He probably would not see them as similar per se. He'd probably see them. I don't think when you deal with like different kinds of spirits, they're like, oh, that guy's just like me on the same team. They're probably like, oh, I recognize that as a similar, kind of like how we talked about the demons.
Okay.
They recognized Athel Loren were kind of similar.
So I think that is a little bit too meta. That's not really how people think. Say, for example, you're living in the Empire and you're, I don't know, Johan the Empire chap. And you hear the weird tales that are coming from, say, Kuresh and all the crazy stuff over there. You don't immediately then think, oh, you know what? They're kind of similar to me because they're mortal.
You go.
It's so beyond what standard thinking is. Now, are they mortal? Yeah. Are they doing stuff? Yeah. But Durthu's not sitting there going, well, they're sort of similar to me in a weird, crazy way. It's just lots of stuff that exists.
Yep. Has there ever been a written conversation between Durthu and Murger? Yeah, we talked about it. Durthu kills him. That one time. If Durthu made a command, when I say command, a request for aid or something to Ariel or Orion that they disagree with, would they obey? Durthu is considered to be equal to them, so it would depend on what exactly the conversation was about.
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship between each of them. Durthu is not king of the elves.
Yeah. Do you think Durthu's ever communed with a Slann? I really doubt it.
You know what? Not. I don't.
Really?
I don't. No, I think it's he was around at the time. I think there's almost no chance that he has not been aware of the old ones, and they are a part of his life's memory. It seems almost impossible for it not to be the case. They were
specifically.
I don't think they necessarily were sitting there chatting with each other, but I do think
I think he's aware of their existence. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if you take a look at just how old he is, there's definitely going to be a greater awareness than many would expect.
That's true. Also, you know what? Yeah, that's fair. I wouldn't be shocked if there were some Slann that were somehow tangentially involved in Athel Loren shenanigans at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly when he's a stripling. The idea that possibly there was certain monitoring going on seems exceedingly low. There would have been some form of connection if you just take it through to its natural expected conclusions. You got to remember that we're not dealing with entities that necessarily sit off by themselves all the time. They can teleport to anywhere in the world to check anything at any time. This is pre-Cataclysm. It's very different to the post-Cataclysm situation. And the old ones are there. This is not are they possibly there? They are. Stuff is happening to their plan. The old ones are kicking around during the High Elf blow up as well. There's definitely the strong likelihood that Durthu has got access to memories many would not expect. And if you're sitting at home thinking, oh, I would like to have a character to discuss some crazy stuff from, the pre-technological situation, then that's a character you could use to do that. Although, good luck talking to Depressed Boy.
Yep. Could Durthu have any forms of bonds with the dragons of the forest? One being deeper than just simply being the guardian. Honestly, with the way the forest dragons are talked about, I would not be surprised if they somewhat revere Durthu as kind of a deific figure, like a representation of the forest itself. So
there's definitely something there.
Yeah, they'd probably acknowledge him. I'm sure he knows some of the dragons and they know him and vice versa, just because they're both so fucking old.
I would be interested to see where dragons are taken post-Cathay.
Yeah, especially because the forest dragons in particular are written to be very fun. Like they're much more active than a lot of other dragons, and they chat with the elves, and they like to play like riddle games and stuff like that. So I would imagine that they do. I'm sure the dragons would actually be quite interested in talking to him. He's probably not as much, vice versa. Yeah. How do you think Durthu would view Xin Yang? That would be I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. That would be a hard one. Did I like Durthu's death? I thought it was in the grand scheme of the old ones, or compared to a lot of the other characters in the end times, it was okay.
I don't like it. I'm sitting here whispering, I didn't like it. No, I don't think it spoke to a good end for Durthu. It didn't. I mean, it resolved the brother situation, I suppose. It felt like it was doing nothing more than setting up a character that they wanted to have for Age of Sigmar. It didn't
Yep.
feel like it was telling the end of his story. It felt like they were telling someone else's story. And for me, that was a disappointing end.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I will say compared to some of the other character deaths.
Agreed completely. So, in fact, let's take a different angle so that I'm not quite so negative. We are really aware of my general dislike of how the end times was handled. And if I was going to put Durthu's death in a ranking of how they all died, his one would be relatively high. But now let's compare that to what I would like to have seen. Oh, we're right down to the bottom tiers here. But because the vast majority of them are all the way down there. So yeah, I agree actually. In terms of the overall death, it wasn't that bad. It had some really cool moments. Yeet, that's super fun. But cut a long story short, it was still completely lacking in clear storytelling for the story of Durthu, his depression, and his redemption. And his redemption simply being setting someone else's character up was weak sauce.
Yeah, it's the eternal issue of the end times, which is all of the worst shit in the end times is because it's setting up for a new setting instead of ending the one it's talking about.
And not only that, a new setting which at that point was not really well considered or thought out, meaning that all of the cool that would come with Age of Sigmar was yet to be figured out.
Yeah, you have to reach your way, start at AOS and reach your way backwards if you want to enjoy any part of the end times. Don't start at the end times and read forward, which is not
agreed
good.
Completely.
Is Optimus Pine's one of the strongest magical swords in the setting, or is it just real big? Yeah, it's kind of just real big. There's nothing that's really talked about with it. Granted, it's huge and it's beautiful.
So this is an example of where the battle game goes wrong. Because they need to balance and bring it out. Durthu should be, given what they basically turn him into in the lore, he should be akin to Nagash, probably more so. His magic sword, created by a god, should be effectively akin to Widowmaker, but for Durthu, and it isn't. It just isn't. It's just like a
pretty some plus one strength or something stupid.
Yeah, it's totally rubbish. And very much does not make him Optimus Pine. It makes him, slightly better, I suppose. It's pants. This is a weapon that absolutely should be made better.
Yeah,
but it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because it would make him too many points in the game because he's already a tree man and too fucking hard.
Sister of the Thorn Carillion in Vermintide invokes the ancients in one of her ultimate quotes. Given this in her overall look, is becoming a Sister of the Thorn pulling enough closer to the power of Athel? A Sister of the Thorn is they're literally handmaidens of Aisha. But from like the Athel perspective, or the handmaidens of Ariel, I guess if you want to be specific. They are super they're the equivalent to Ariel what Wild Riders are to Orion, is the best way to put it. No, but they're not turning into trees. No, it's a spiritual connection, but they're still elves. Let's see. Optimus Prime has been given two buttons. One deletes Morgr from existence. The other erases Thorgrim Grudgebearer. He would slam the Morgr button over and over and over.
Easy. Yeah. I mean, dwarves are not strictly speaking the enemy. Dwarves were made the enemy.
Yeah. What is Durthu's biggest regret? Probably that.
Not saving the Everqueen.
Yeah, probably that moment. I don't know how he would phrase it exactly, is what aspect of it was the worst part, but it would be something in that moment.
Yep. I think actually, if you look at it, given where they eventually went with the world routes, if he could, with retrospect, look back, he would have taken her and possibly all the other elves away from Avalorn, and confronted his brothers and said, this is what needs to happen. What he did was he was too, if anything, shy, too afraid of what his peers would say, too afraid of the ultimate deal that he puts in place. He should have gone further. And I think that ultimately is what haunts him. The fact that, yes, he made a mistake with the elves, but the mistake perhaps was not bringing them on side earlier.
Yeah,
using them better.
Yep. Let's see. Do Durthu or any tree people care about the elven gods? Somewhat.
Care is an interesting word.
Yeah.
They are very real entities of extraordinary power. Durthu is the same. So you can come to your own conclusions as to what you think about that. Durthu is a complicated character, and so are they.
Durthu and Kolek Suneater enter a ring. Who leaves alive? That is a bitch. That's a hard one.
Any of these big characters are a hard one. Who would win?
Yeah, that might make a good one. Is Kodo stronger than Durthu?
Different.
Strong. Yeah, he's different.
I think stronger as a single word. Yes, because he is literally the strong, fighty one. But is Kodo much more tricky, capable of getting more out of the situation? It's like Thor and Loki. Okay, is one stronger than the other? You could say, yeah, Thor is stronger, yet Loki always seems to get the bloody blade in. They are two different gods. For once of a perspective, they have their own tone.
Yep. How does Durthu view the Zotes? Probably as like old allies that he doesn't talk to terribly frequently, but I imagine like he would know them better than probably anybody, to be honest.
Yeah, ditto.
What would a meeting between Mother Ostankya and Durthu be like? Super interesting, in my opinion. Because he's kind of a malevolent spirit in the way he is now. I think, though Mother Ostankya's focus on only Kislev would kind of skew it a little, but if you were those are two characters that if they actually had a conversation, I think could be very interesting.
I mean, ultimately, given the way they're moving Mother Ostankya, she could literally just be Durthu of Kislev.
Yeah, true.
You know, that it's basically a meeting again. I mean, the way that they're respinning the hags is putting Mother Ostankya as quite separate to them and potentially a manifestation of all the spirits. And she is almost the anthropomorphization of all of that. Effectively, she is the god of the spirits in Kislev. And if that is the case, she's basically just a different version of Durthu.
Yeah, I think for me, it would depend on, is Mother Ostankya just a spirit that wears the guise of an old woman, or is she more like an avatar where she's an old woman that has all these powers? If it's the latter, I think they could have a very interesting discussion. If it's the former, they would kind of just be very similar creatures.
Yeah, given what we know of the world so far, really only the elves have got a manifestation power for gods until literally the end of the world comes. So it seems most likely, given what we have, she's probably a spirit.
Yeah, which I'm totally fine with.
I'm totally fine with too. Yeah.
Potato salad. What kind of meal would ogres make from Durthu? They'd probably turn him into kindling more than a meal, or maybe they'd be like, oh, fiber. But ogres are pretty obsessed with meat primarily. There's actually a lot of really fun stories in the 8th edition Wood Elf book that ogres actually tend to ally with the elves more often, or the Wood Elves more often than not, because the Wood Elves are really good about directing them to other threats, and the ogres are always just like, oh, great, cool. There's actually a funny comment I love of, there's like an ogre horde that comes down on Athel Loren, and they redirect them into an enemy, and the ogres get genuinely hurt, like emotionally, that the elves don't join them for the feast of like eating a bunch of roasted Skaven afterwards or something, because they like roast up all their enemies and they're like, hey, y'all should come join the feast since you brought us here. The elves are like, no, thank you. And the ogres are like, oh. It just cracks me up. Let's see. Brady, after watching all of your streams, I feel like I'm starting to see a lot of parallels between Ostankya and Durthu. She kind of teaches the Ungol people to defend and respect the forest, just like Durthu did with the elves. Could she be an ancient spirit? Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yep, that's what we're talking about.
Agreed completely, and that's a good observation.
Yep. Ross Ion, what's the deal with the glowing runes Durthu and other tree spirits seem to have along their bodies? Are they purely symbolic, or do they have power like dwarf runes? Are they elvish? If they're on the models, they have like runes inscribed to their bark and stuff. Those are probably they could be natural, but they could also be things that the elves kind of ceremonially carved into them that represent certain concepts or ideals. I don't know which one it would necessarily be.
Yeah, it's not specifically detailed. So the answers that we'd provide for this are ultimately going to be made up.
Yeah. So do what you will with that information. It's Mother's Day in the UK today. Well, happy Mother's Day to people in the UK.
I'm going to be calling my mom very soon.
Did Durthu love his mom? Sadly, I don't think he had one, technically, unless you're considering the old ones. He said,
I think possibly. I think there is a relatively strong chance that he comes from the Oak of Ages.
Yeah.
In that the Oak of Ages was first planted.
That's fair.
It came up, and then the very first saplings that came from that grew into the very first and oldest of the spirits that would eventually have their own life. So you could argue that the Oak of Ages is mum, but it's an argument. It's not stated anywhere.
Yep. All right. Okay. Here's the perfect last question for Maharaja of End. I love this question. I'm very curious what Andy will think because of the thing I'm going to add to it. So keeping in mind Durthu's history is what I'm adding, and his relationship with what happened with the Elves of Avalorn. The question is, what do you think Durthu would think of the Lorelorn forest and the elves who live there?
So I think that the Lorelorn forest, at least as I was writing it, is not as magically active as Athel Loren. So it is not Athel Loren. This makes that very clear.
Yeah.
It's also nothing like Avalorn, both in terms of what once was and what it became later. So it is nothing more than more elves. It's as interesting as anywhere else that's populated by elves, but they have strong connections to the wood, so potentially allies, I suppose. But I don't think that, given the nature of his character, he would give them any thought at all. He is far too depressed and caught up in what he's doing currently. If he was a different character, I think he would have lots of opinions as to exactly what's going on with it.
Oakhart would have had a lot of opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. Oakhart would have been right in there, particularly given that the descendants of the Everqueen are ruling in that particular area. So, there's even familial blood ties there that could interest him. But cut a long story short, he is so far gone that the Lorelorn just is not really of that much interest to him at all. He has got far too many things to worry about that happened in the past.
Yeah, I don't know how this would run as a campaign. You need a really good GM, but I would love a campaign that has that's mostly focused on Athel Loren, where you have a notable arc, which is about like a group of players trying to get through Durthu's depression.
Yeah, that'd be super fun.
Like either trying to rouse him for information or just try to rouse him just to be try to be better, to heal. That could be a really tragic, fun campaign.
Yeah, that's the sort of campaign where you'd be looking for deep flashbacks, so you can actually, and they would be manifesting through all of the great.
Yeah. You go through Athel Loren, you get to go to other times.
Yeah, the lamentations spinning around, whispering. Awesome. Oh, it'd be super fun. Yeah, that'd be super.
You could do so many mindfucky things in the Athel Loren campaign.
Yeah, totally. So, should we check our last? You're doing it right now. Excellent.
Michael, once again, y'all taking a subject I was meh about and made it interesting. I voted for vampires, but this is very enjoyable.
Yeah, I hope that's the case for subjects like this, because I often think that not only do most of the people who are playing with the characters not really know what they are and not really consider what they are in the greater Warhammer world, but even the people who are writing them often have no idea just how much awesome there is sitting beneath their fingertips when they're dealing with some of these characters. So I really enjoy these streams in particular, because we get an opportunity to dive deep into a character that many people go, oh, it's just a Treeman, isn't it? Yeah, no. This is something much, much bigger and fundamental to the Warhammer world as a whole.
Saurus Bloods. Oh, boy. Oh boy, how do premonitions work in Warhammer? In Lords of the Lance, seems like premonitions mean looking through all possible futures. How does it work? Does it work the same for Treeman Elder? It depends.
Yeah, this is a complicated question with a complicated answer, but generally speaking, and I do say this in the broadest of terms, most future viewing powers, whether that's coming from, say, the Celestial College, whether that's coming from people who are otherwise attached to Azir and capable of seeing what might come next, or if they're just seers, perhaps receiving direct revelation from a deity or something similar, most of them come with effectively probability. The most likely outcome is this, and that will come to pass if these things happen. And there are multiple different paths you could take. And the whole concept of the Warhammer world, in many respects, is no matter which path is tread, it all ends in the same place, which is the absolute end of all things with chaos. And ultimately, that lies at the very heart of Tzeentch. Tzeentch is the great architect, after all, who has basically come up with the plan to ruin the entire world. And it started with the Cataclysm.
Yep. Joseph Manford, thank you. This is awesome. This is why he's my favorite character. Oh, I'm
Yay!
glad we could fulfill that for you.
Delighted you enjoyed it.
Mandatus Callum, been working on a lightly kit bash dragon for my Azrai Lord this stream. Shorter neck compared to the old or Tor War model. Annoys me a little bit, but it's good. Oh, well, good. I'm glad that it's turned out well.
That's turning out well.
Sisters of the Thorn equal Power Rangers. Not entirely wrong. not wholly inaccurate.
Wow, I'm not going to deny that one.
All the like poses when they. How is Durthu different from other angry trees? Because he can actually move and has a personality and a long history and can use magic.
And he's the oldest of them.
Excuse me. Yeah.
You know, he's the oldest surviving one.
The carvings on Durthu read Ariel and Orion. He just
was your little heart.
Wakes up from a nap and elves have been drawing on him. What does Durthu think of the twins? We unfortunately, that is something I would love to answer in detail, but we don't know. We actually don't get a lot of information on him and Nyasha and Arahan.
No.
The thing that would be interesting is Durthu would probably know what they actually really are. Which would be like the only people that seem to know what they really are Orion, Ariel, and Durthu. Well, probably like Daith.
Maybe Daith. Yeah.
Yeah. But Daith. Durthu would probably be keenly aware of their true nature, which would probably, impact how he feels towards them. But unfortunately, we don't get to see them talk to each other.
No.
Cody Smith, what is the Lizardmen's relationship with the High Elves versus the Wood Elves? Are they treated similarly? So the TLDR I'll give you on this is that Lizardman relationship is generally stay out of our shit, don't touch us, and if we come to do something, get out of our way. Is generally how they act. The High Elves tend to see the Lizardmen much more often, just because there are High Elves kind of in and around Lustria. And the High Elves have done a fairly good job of like taking care of a lot of geomantic nexus points. But the Wood Elves very, very, very rarely interact with the Lizardmen, if ever.
They're just in a very different part of the world with very different concerns.
Like, have Wood Elves teleported to Lustria or the Southlands to do something and maybe encountered the Lizardmen? Probably. But the Wood Elves and the Lizardmen's objectives are probably very similarly aligned when you're talking about maintaining the geomantic web and protecting the weave, which is like the balance of life and death in the world.
Good old weave.
Yeah, the Wood Elves and the Lizardmen are very adjacent powers. That's not to say they wouldn't have reasons to fight. There are things that could happen where the Lizardmen are like, the Great Plan says we must do this, and the Wood Elves go, no, you can't touch that. Like, that's important to what we're doing, and that would obviously cause a conflict. But those would probably be quite rare.
Yep.
All right.
And that's an end.
Yeah. So Thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the Durthu stream. We really appreciate all the generous support today. Thank you all so much.
It's been a really good one, I think. I really enjoyed that stream. Largely because it's a character that, as I opened with, I despised to begin with because I freaking hated that model. And it's really nice. It's really nice to see the character completely turn around in my eyes, at the very least. And I do think it's one of those characters that Games Workshop has taken into a very interesting place. Now, obviously, I didn't necessarily like what was done with it in the end times, but I nevertheless think that Durthu is one of the great characters of Warhammer that most people don't realize is a great character of Warhammer. They just see him as, isn't that just the Treeman with the Wood Elf faction? And the answer is, nah. When it comes there's a lot more.
When it comes to like tragic characters, he's probably in the top 5, top 3, which is great. That's an awesome list to be on.
Yeah, it's good.
But yeah,
right.
That's gonna be
that's good.
Today. We hope you all have fun.
I'm about to pop off and have a chat with some patron people over on the LAWhammer side, because it's my monthly chat with some of my monthly call patron people.
Yeah, so think about that. If you're a patron of the appropriate tier over on LAWhammer, you can get a monthly chat with Andy. You can just hang out with Andy.
Andy and whatever cast turn up. It's different every time.
Yeah, so if that sounds like something you're like, oh, I would love to do that, and I could actually bother him personally with questions without having.
And you literally can, and we just sit and chat. It's super fun.
So,
our last one was literally only about a quarter of it was LAWhammer, and the other 3/4 of it were entirely unrelated stuff, which was super cool.
All right. So anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Hawk. One is said.
I just noticed that post right this very second. I'm going to open up Discord so that I respond to him.
Cool.
I'll do it after. It's just so Hawk, if you're out there, I will do it after my patron call that I'm going to be doing in around about 18 minutes. So I'll do it after that. But I'm just opening it now. Hawk,
that's all for us here. Thank you all for joining us. I think I am going to come up with some pretty nasty ideas for the next Lorebeards poll. So stay tuned for that. It'll be on Andy's channel.
Oh yeah.
And we will see that. I see one last super chat came in, and then we're out of here. Dragon Age and Warhammer should have a crossover so Durthu can meet the rhyming tree from Dragon Age 1.
I love Dragon Age 1. I really enjoyed that game back in the day.
It's a masterpiece. It's a fucking masterpiece of a game.
Yeah,
All right,
good game.
thank you for watching. Bye-bye, guys.
See you all later. Bye-bye.